My wife died in a sudden accident. A few days later, a notary handed me the keys to a luxury penthouse saying it was in my name now. She had strictly forbidden me from asking about her business trips while she was alive. I planned to appraise the property for a quick sale, but before doing so, I decided to visit. When I opened the door, I froze in shock, because sitting in the living room was the last person I ever expected to see. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Benjamin. I am 69 years old. For 30 years, I worked as a forensic auditor. My entire career was built on tracking missing funds, analyzing discrepancies, and untangling massive webs of corporate deceit. I spent my life finding the truth buried under mountains of lies. When I retired, I thought my days of uncovering betrayal were permanently behind me. I was wrong. The betrayal I was about to uncover was not in a corporate boardroom, it was inside my own family. The wind at the cemetery was biting. It cut right through my heavy wool coat as the minister spoke his final words over Naomi's casket. My wife of 40 years was gone, taken from me in a devastating car crash. Beside me stood my daughter Alicia. Her head was bowed in silence. Next to her was her husband Bradley. Bradley was a wealthy, fast-talking chief financial officer who had always viewed me with thinly veiled condescension. Now he had his arm draped heavily over Alicia's shoulder. His face was contorted into a mask of profound sorrow specifically designed for the other attendees to see. But I spent 3 decades reading people in high-pressure situations. I observed the stiffness in his posture. I noticed his completely dry eyes behind that practiced grimace. I registered the distinct lack of genuine grief. He actually checked his luxury watch twice while the casket was being lowered into the earth. He was not mourning. He was waiting for an obligation to end. The moment the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward their cars, a woman in a sharp gray suit intercepted my path. She introduced herself as a notary public. She offered no words of comfort or condolence. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and pressed a heavy brass key along with a crisp white address card directly into my palm. She stated that Naomi had left strict, irrevocable instructions. The key and the address were to be handed to me only after she was officially in the ground. Naomi had traveled constantly during our marriage for what she described as high-level corporate consulting. She had strictly forbidden me from asking about the specifics of her business trips while she was alive. I respected her boundaries. I stared at the address card in my hand. It listed a premium building located right in the heart of the financial district. It was a luxury property I never knew we owned. I drove straight from the cemetery to the downtown address. My mind processed the situation not with the raw emotion of a grieving husband, but with the cold mechanical calculation of an auditor. If Naomi owned this high-value asset, it needed to be immediately appraised and secured. I navigated the expansive marble lobby, rode the private elevator up to the top floor, and stood before a heavy mahogany door. I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I stepped inside, fully expecting to find an empty, sterile corporate suite filled with dusty furniture and forgotten files. Instead, the air hit me like a physical blow. The penthouse reeked heavily of cheap floral perfume. It was a jarring, vulgar contrast to the subtle cedar and vanilla scent Naomi always wore. The apartment itself was magnificent, boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. But my eyes locked immediately on the center of the sprawling living room. Sitting on a pristine Italian leather sofa was my son-in-law Bradley. His expensive silk tie was discarded carelessly on the floor. His tailored dress shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He was leaning back, completely relaxed, casually pouring expensive champagne into a crystal flute for a blonde woman sitting close beside him. I instantly recognized her. She was Rachel, the vice president of the bank where I currently held my entire life savings and pension accounts. They were laughing together. The massive glass coffee table in front of them was completely covered in scattered legal documents, bank statements, and thick folders. My trained eyes immediately recognized the distinctive blue covers of asset transfer forms and the red stamps of expedited notary approvals. They were not just having an affair. They were actively dismantling an estate. This was not a moment of shared mourning for his deceased mother-in-law. This was a private, calculated celebration of a successful acquisition. My wife had been resting in the cold ground for less than 2 hours, and the man who swore to love and protect my daughter was drinking champagne with his mistress, inside a secret penthouse my wife secretly owned. The heavy mahogany door slipped from my hand and closed softly behind me with a faint click. The sound echoed through the vast open room. Bradley froze mid-pour. The champagne spilled over the rim of the crystal flute, splashing directly onto the scattered legal documents. He slowly turned his head. His eyes widened significantly as his brain desperately processed my unexpected presence. Rachel scrambled to sit upright hastily, pulling her unbuttoned blazer closed and looking away in embarrassment. For a fraction of a second, I saw absolute unadulterated panic flash in Bradley's eyes. He had been caught in the ultimate betrayal. But that panic vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. He set the champagne bottle down on the glass table with a sharp, aggressive thud. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a single ounce of shame, guilt, or fear, his shock morphed into instant vile arrogance. He stood up, smoothing his hair back, and let out a short, mocking laugh that cut through the tension in the room. He reached down to the messy glass table and deliberately pulled a thick, stapled document from the pile. He held it up in the air like a trophy. I could clearly see the embossed seal of a property transfer deed. He took 2 aggressive steps toward me, his face hardening into a look of absolute contempt, completely shedding the mask of the grieving son-in-law he wore at the cemetery just hours ago. He did not offer an explanation for the bank executive sitting on the sofa. He did not offer an excuse for drinking in my deceased wife's hidden property. He pointed a firm finger directly at my chest. His voice echoed with cold, undeniable authority. He ordered me to get out of his house immediately, claiming that this property and everything inside it belonged exclusively to him now. Bradley closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He shoved me hard against the heavy mahogany door frame. The impact rattled my teeth and sent a sharp jolt of pain down my spine. At 69 years old, my physical body lacked the resilience of my youth, but my mind remained a steel trap. 30 years as a forensic auditor taught me one undeniable truth. The man who loses his temper loses the war. I had sat across conference tables from cornered billionaires, hostile corporate raiders, and desperate embezzlers who threatened to ruin my life. I survived them all by mastering the art of absolute stillness. I refused to give Bradley the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not throw a single punch. I did not raise my voice. I simply absorbed the blow and used the moment of physical contact to let my eyes sweep the penthouse living room with surgical precision. The environment was a crime scene of financial infidelity. I cataloged every detail: the half-empty bottles of vintage champagne, the expedited notary stamps on the scattered blue folders, Rachel sitting on the sofa, her face flushed, hastily adjusting her blouse. She was the vice president of the very bank branch where I held my entire life savings. Her presence here with my son-in-law transformed a distasteful affair into a calculated financial conspiracy. Then my gaze drifted toward a sleek armchair positioned near the floor-to-ceiling window. Draped over the back of the chair was a familiar camel-colored trench coat. It belonged to Naomi. She had worn it the morning she died. Protruding from the deep side pocket was the edge of a black leather-bound ledger. I recognized it instantly. It was the notebook she always carried on her frequent, highly secretive business trips. She had guarded that ledger with absolute ferocity while she was alive. Bradley was too busy inflating his chest and shouting threats to notice where my attention had landed. He barked another order for me to vacate his property, his face red with a volatile mix of panic and unearned authority. I needed that ledger. It was the key to understanding why my wife had hidden this penthouse and why my arrogant son-in-law was celebrating her death with my personal banker. Bradley lunged forward again, raising his arm to physically push me out the door. I used his aggressive momentum against him. I feigned a clumsy stumble, letting my knees buckle just enough to sell the image of a frail, grieving old man losing his balance. I fell heavily against the armchair. In one swift, practiced motion, shielded by my own body weight, I slipped the black leather ledger from Naomi's coat pocket and slid it directly inside the inner lining of my jacket. I gripped the armrest, pulled myself up slowly, and smoothed the lapels of my dark suit. I looked directly into Bradley's eyes. I offered no words of anger or sorrow. I gave him absolutely nothing to react to, no anger to feed his massive ego, no fear to validate his dominance. I turned my back on him and walked out into the corridor, leaving the penthouse in complete, suffocating silence. The long drive back to my modest suburban home was a blur of neon streetlights and cold calculation. The quiet 4-bedroom house felt entirely different the moment I stepped inside. It was no longer a sanctuary of shared family memories. It felt like a tactical staging ground. I walked straight to my study, locked the heavy wooden door, and placed the black ledger on my oak desk. I turned on the brass reading lamp and opened the cover. The pages were filled with Naomi's unmistakable, meticulous handwriting. It was not a diary of her personal thoughts. It was a rigorous forensic map. My eyes scanned the dense columns of dates, account numbers, and routing codes. My blood ran cold as the reality of the numbers settled into my brain. Naomi had tracked a sophisticated financial hemorrhage. For the past 3 years, massive unauthorized wire transfers had been bleeding directly out of my primary retirement funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been systematically siphoned off in increments carefully designed to evade automated banking alerts. I traced the destination of the stolen funds row by row. Every single wire transfer was routed through a complex web of offshore shell companies. And at the center of that web, listed as the primary beneficiary of the holding accounts, was Bradley. My son-in-law had not just been sleeping with the vice president of my bank. He had weaponized her executive position to entirely drain my life savings right under my nose. Naomi knew everything. She had spent her final years compiling this irrefutable paper trail. She was building an airtight case to destroy him. The suddenness of her fatal car crash took on a deeply sinister light. She had gathered enough evidence to send a chief financial officer to federal prison for decades, and then she mysteriously drove off a steep ravine. I closed the ledger, the leather cover cool against my fingertips. Bradley thought he had outsmarted a retired old man. He failed to realize he had just handed a veteran auditor the exact blueprint of his own destruction. The sharp, piercing ring of my cell phone shattered the heavy silence of the study. The caller ID displayed Alicia's name. I took a slow, measured breath before answering the call. I expected to hear the trembling voice of a daughter mourning the mother she had just buried hours ago. I expected shared grief and comfort. I received neither. "Dad," Alicia said. Her voice was flat, brisk, and entirely devoid of empathy. It sounded exactly like a corporate directive. "You need to be at the lawyer's office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I remained silent for a moment, letting the sheer coldness of her tone register in my mind. "For what purpose, Alicia?" "To sign over the deed to the suburban house," she stated without a single tremor of hesitation. "Bradley and I went through Mom's private records. She left behind a massive mountain of hidden debts. Creditors are preparing to seize everything you own. Signing the house over to Bradley's holding company is the only legal way to shield the asset and cover what she owes." The raw audacity of the lie hung in the air between us. Alicia was perfectly parroting a script Bradley had clearly written for her. They were moving to strip me of my last remaining asset before the sun even rose on my first day as a widower. They wrongly assumed my profound grief would render me compliant, confused, and weak. 9 o'clock, she repeated, her tone hardening into a strict demand. "Do not be late, Dad. We are doing this to protect you." The line went dead. I lowered the phone to the desk. They wanted my home. They wanted my complete surrender. I placed my hand firmly over Naomi's black ledger. The mourning period was officially over. I dialed Alicia's number right back. The phone rang twice before she answered, her breath hitching slightly, expecting my unconditional surrender. I did not give her the satisfaction of anger. 30 years of interrogating embezzlers had taught me that a flat, emotionless tone strips a liar of their power. I informed her I would not be attending any meeting at any lawyer's office, nor would I ever sign the deed to my home over to her husband. Alicia immediately raised her voice, repeating her rehearsed script about Naomi's supposed hidden debts and the immediate danger of creditors. I cut through her frantic performance with a single, highly specific question. I asked her why Bradley was pouring champagne for a white bank executive inside a luxury downtown penthouse just 2 hours after her mother was lowered into the ground. The line went dead silent. I could hear the rapid, shallow intake of her breath. She had assumed I was utterly incapacitated by grief, blindly weeping in my study. She had severely miscalculated. When Alicia finally spoke, the veneer of the concerned daughter completely vanished. Her voice turned venomous, laced with a cornered, vicious panic. She accused me of suffering from severe hallucinations. She claimed the stress of the funeral had completely shattered my grip on reality. She insisted Bradley was at his corporate office dealing with the fallout of Naomi's financial mess. She warned me that if I continued to display such severe paranoia, she and Bradley would be forced to take drastic measures to protect me from myself. Then she hung up, leaving a harsh dial tone echoing in the quiet of my study. She did not realize that her aggressive deflection had just confirmed my darkest suspicions. The penthouse was a secret to her as well, or she was fully complicit in its existence. Either way, the battle lines were officially drawn. The next morning, I drove to the local grocery store. I needed to test the perimeter of their attack. Bradley was a chief financial officer. He operated through spreadsheets, ledgers, and systematic control. I knew he would not stop at a simple phone threat. At the checkout counter, I handed the cashier my debit card to pay for a few basic items. The machine beeped, flashing a bright red decline notification. I handed her a secondary credit card. The machine rejected that one as well. The cashier gave me a look of polite pity, the kind reserved for elderly men who have lost track of their meager pensions. I left the groceries on the conveyor belt and walked directly to my car. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank. I bypassed the standard teller line and demanded to speak with the branch manager. Instead, a nervous assistant escorted me into a small glass-walled office. The assistant pulled up my profile on his monitor, his eyes widening as he read the system alerts. He cleared his throat nervously and informed me that a comprehensive legal hold had been placed on my entire portfolio. My checking account, my savings, and the substantial pension I had built over 30 years of meticulous auditing were all entirely frozen. I demanded to see the authorization order. The assistant hesitated, but under my unyielding gaze, he turned the monitor toward me. The freeze had been initiated late last night by Bradley. He had bypassed standard judicial protocol by leveraging a direct internal contact at the bank. I immediately recognized the digital signature of the authorizing executive. It belonged to Rachel, the vice president I had seen sipping champagne on the Italian leather sofa. Bradley had submitted an emergency medical injunction to justify the freeze. He attached a psychiatric evaluation from an exclusive private medical clinic. The document explicitly declared that I had suffered a catastrophic psychological break following my wife's sudden death. It diagnosed me with acute grief-induced dementia, stating I posed a severe and immediate financial danger to myself. The evaluation claimed I was experiencing vivid hallucinations and severe paranoia. Bradley had laid the perfect paper trail to strip me of my resources, leaving me entirely defenseless. They had weaponized my mourning against me, using my bank as the executioner. I walked out of the bank and stood on the bustling city sidewalk. The morning sun was bright, but I felt an icy clarity settle over my mind. I was a 69-year-old man standing in the financial district with absolutely zero access to capital. I could not buy a gallon of gas. I could not hire a defense attorney to contest the fraudulent psychiatric hold. Bradley and Rachel had executed a flawless financial decapitation. They assumed a man of my age, suddenly rendered destitute and legally branded as incompetent, would simply collapse under the weight of the assault. They expected me to return to my empty suburban house and wait for their final blow. I got into my car and locked the doors. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out Naomi's black leather ledger. I had spent hours analyzing the offshore wire transfers the night before, but I knew my wife better than anyone. Naomi was a strategist. If she had uncovered a conspiracy of this magnitude, she would have built a contingency plan. I bypassed the pages of routing numbers and flipped directly to the very last page of the book. I expected to find a hidden account number or a safe deposit box code. Instead, the page was entirely blank, save for a single crisp line written in stark red ink. The handwriting was rushed but deliberate. It read, "If the accounts go dark open, Post Office Box 402 at Central Station." I scoured the bottom of my desk drawers and the forgotten pockets of my old winter coats. Bradley and Rachel had effectively erased 30 years of my financial existence with a single forged document. They could not erase the jar of emergency quarters Naomi always kept above the refrigerator. I counted out exactly $2.75. It was the exact fare for the city transit bus. Yesterday, I was a comfortable retiree with a formidable pension. Today, I was a fugitive in my own life, riding the rattling rear seat of a public transport vehicle toward the central train station. The heavy diesel engine hummed beneath me. It was a stark contrast to the quiet luxury of the penthouse where my son-in-law had gleefully celebrated my wife's death. I gripped my jacket tightly around me. Naomi's black ledger felt like a brick resting against my ribs. The bus deposited me at the edge of the bustling terminal. The station was a cavernous dome of echoing voices, rushing commuters, and cold marble floors. My forensic training immediately kicked in. I kept my head down, avoiding the direct line of sight of the security cameras mounted near the ticket kiosks. Bradley had the bank in his pocket. I had to assume he had the resources to track my face if he knew where to look. I navigated the labyrinth of underground corridors until I reached the archaic section of postal lockers. The metal panels were scratched and faded. I scanned the brass numbers until I found 402. My hands were remarkably steady as I retrieved a small, jagged brass key from the secret compartment of Naomi's ledger. I slid the key into the slot and turned it. The rusted hinges groaned. Inside the dark, narrow cavity rested a single bulky manila envelope. I pulled it out. The weight of it was substantial. I tore the sealed flap open just enough to glimpse the contents. Stacked neatly inside were tightly bound bricks of untraceable $100 bills. My auditor mind instantly calculated the volume. It was exactly $100,000 in pure cash. Resting beneath the stacks of currency was a heavy matte black smartphone. It was an encrypted burner device, the kind designed to leave absolutely no digital footprint. Naomi had known a financial execution was coming. She had prepared a war chest for me to fight back. I took the phone and the cash, shoved the envelope deep into my coat, and slammed the locker shut. I walked briskly toward the crowded food court to blend in with the mass of travelers. I sat at a small, sticky table in the corner, shielding the device with my body. I held the power button. The screen illuminated with a harsh white light. The device bypassed the standard setup screens entirely. It was already loaded with a highly secure, untraceable operating system. Before I could even examine the interface, the phone vibrated violently in my palm. A text message materialized on the blank screen. It contained no phone number, just an anonymous sender identification. The message read exactly as follows. "Do you have the ledger? Have they locked your accounts?" I stared at the glowing letters. My pulse drummed a rapid beat against my neck. Whoever was on the other end of this connection knew the intimate details of Naomi's contingency plan. They knew about the black book. They knew about Bradley's financial assault. I typed a response using the encrypted keypad. I demanded to know who I was speaking to. I hit send. The response arrived 3 seconds later. The words chilled the blood in my veins. The message read that he was the man my wife paid to keep me breathing, instructing me to walk to the south exit and get into the black sedan. I read the sentence twice, to keep me breathing. Bradley's arrogance from the penthouse echoed in my mind. He wanted my house. He wanted my pension. This message implied a physical threat, a danger that went far beyond forged psychiatric evaluations and stolen retirement funds. I stood up, pushing my chair back abruptly. I did not look around to see if anyone was watching. I moved with urgent purpose. I weaved through the throngs of tourists and commuters, keeping my gait steady and my expression blank. I followed the faded overhead signs pointing toward the south exit. The heavy glass doors slid open. A blast of cold city air and the heavy scent of exhaust fumes hit my face. I scanned the chaotic drop-off lane. Amidst the yellow taxis and idling shuttles, a pristine black sedan sat with its engine running softly. The windows were heavily tinted, betraying nothing of the interior. I approached the passenger side. I did not hesitate. I reached out and pulled the door handle. The heavy door swung open. I slid into the leather passenger seat and closed the door behind me, sealing out the noise of the bustling street. The interior of the sedan was immaculate and smelled faintly of dark roast coffee and leather. Sitting behind the steering wheel was a solidly built, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. He wore a dark tailored suit that failed to hide his muscular frame. His face was weathered, marked by a quiet, calculating intensity. He did not offer his hand for a handshake. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply shifted the car into gear and pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the dense city traffic. I stared at him, demanding to know his name. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead and told me his name was Dominic. Before I could ask another question, Dominic reached into the center console. He retrieved a thick, official-looking document folder sealed with a red evidence tape. He tossed it casually onto my lap. He told me to read it carefully. I recognized the seal on the cover immediately. It was a classified police forensics report. My hands gripped the edges of the folder. I broke the seal and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page contained highly technical mechanical schematics of a vehicle's undercarriage. The second page held high-resolution, full-color photographs of a mangled braking mechanism. I read the bolded conclusion at the bottom of the summary page. The words leaped off the paper and burned themselves into my memory. The official forensic analysis confirmed that the catastrophic failure of my wife's vehicle was absolutely not the result of a tragic mechanical malfunction. The brake lines on Naomi's car had been surgically and intentionally severed. The collision was not an accident. My wife was murdered. Dominic kept his eyes locked on the rearview mirror as he navigated the black sedan through the labyrinth of congested city streets. He bluntly warned me against taking the forensic file to the local police precinct. The captain of that district was securely buried deep inside Bradley's corporate payroll. Handing over the irrefutable proof of Naomi's murdered brake lines would only result in the evidence permanently disappearing and my immediate involuntary institutionalization. Dominic instructed me to go back to my empty house and weaponize my enemy's gross underestimation of me. I had to become exactly what they desperately needed me to be. A broken, confused old man entirely consumed by the crushing weight of grief. I stepped out of the black sedan a block away from my property and walked the rest of the way. The silence of the empty rooms pressed heavily against my shoulders, but my mind operated with absolute cold precision. I picked up the landline in the kitchen and dialed Alicia's number. When she answered, I did not use the sharp, authoritative tone I had used during our previous confrontation. Instead, I forced my voice to tremble. I let out a ragged breath and asked her where her mother was. I pleaded with her, claiming I had looked in every room and could not remember how to drive to the grocery store. I sobbed into the receiver, apologizing for my earlier hostility, begging her to come over and help me figure out what was happening to my mind. Alicia's response was swift and sickeningly sweet. She promised to be right there to take care of everything. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver and wiped my completely dry eyes. The trap was set. They fully believed my mind had finally snapped. Exactly 60 minutes later, the harsh screech of heavy commercial tires broke the quiet sanctuary of my suburban street. I stood near the edge of the living room window, maintaining my slumped, defeated posture. Alicia did not arrive alone to comfort her grieving father. She stepped out of the passenger side of a massive commercial moving truck. Behind her emerged a rough crew of 4 men carrying heavy packing crates and industrial dollies. But it was the second vehicle pulling into my driveway that confirmed the absolute depth of her betrayal. A rusted white van parked abruptly, and 2 massive burly men in faded medical scrubs stepped out onto the concrete. They were professional orderlies, the kind of physical enforcers employed by low-income state-run psychiatric facilities to manage aggressive patients. Alicia unlocked the front door using the spare emergency key I had given her years ago. She marched into my living room with the cold, detached authority of a corporate executioner. I looked at my only daughter. My mind flashed back to the countless nights I worked double shifts at the accounting firm, running purely on black coffee and sheer willpower, just to ensure her Ivy League tuition was paid in full without a single student loan. I remembered missing my own anniversaries to audit hostile takeovers so she could drive a safe car and live in a premium neighborhood. Now she looked at me with eyes completely devoid of warmth or familial recognition. The greed had entirely consumed her humanity. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply motioned for the 2 massive orderlies to step forward. They flanked me immediately, crossing their thick arms, their sheer physical presence serving as an unspoken threat of violence if I dared to resist my extraction. Alicia spoke to me as if I were a deaf, ignorant child. She announced that she was moving me to a specialized care facility for my own safety, and that the house was being packed up to cover my mounting medical debts. I kept my head down, letting my hands shake visibly against my sides. I played the role of the defeated patriarch to absolute perfection because I needed her to feel completely in control. Ignoring my trembling hands and submissive posture, Alicia turned her back on me and began barking aggressive, rapid-fire orders at the moving crew. She completely bypassed the antique silver collection, her mother's pristine china cabinet, and the expensive electronics in the living room. She pointed her manicured finger directly down the hallway toward my private study. She instructed the men to bring the heavy steel dollies and head straight for the back room. Her voice echoed off the hallway walls, sharp and highly impatient. She explicitly ordered the crew to focus all their immediate efforts on extracting the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor beneath my oak desk. One of the movers hesitated, questioning the urgency of moving a simple metal box before clearing the larger furniture. Alicia snapped at him, her voice dripping with venomous greed and unchecked ambition. She declared that the safe had to be extracted intact and transported directly to Bradley's corporate office immediately because it held the original documents for a $5 million life insurance policy. I remained standing between the 2 massive orderlies, my posture hunched and deliberately fragile. But internally, the blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. My mind processed the magnitude of her statement with terrifying clarity. I stood perfectly still, letting the terrifying reality wash over me. I had managed my finances with absolute paranoid precision for my entire adult life. I knew every single cent to my name. I never purchased a $5 million life insurance policy. I let the silence hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds. The frail, trembling posture I had adopted melted away completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back as the decades of sharp forensic discipline flooded my system. I reached into my coat pocket, bypassing Naomi's ledger, and retrieved the heavy black burner phone Dominic had provided. I pressed a single pre-programmed button. I did not break eye contact with my daughter. Alicia frowned, her mouth opening to issue another vicious command. She never got the chance. The heavy oak door connecting the study to the kitchen swung open. 3 men stepped into the room. They were not local police, and they certainly were not state-run orderlies. They were private elite security contractors Dominic had secured using a fraction of the untraceable cash from Post Office Box 402. They wore tactical black clothing and moved with terrifying silent efficiency. The 2 burly orderlies turned, their aggressive posturing evaporating the moment they recognized they were completely outmatched. One orderly took a step forward, raising a hand. The lead security contractor grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it sharply, and drove his knee into the orderly's thigh, sending the massive man crashing to the hardwood floor in a heap of groans. The moving crew dropped their heavy dollies immediately. They did not ask questions. They scrambled over each other, sprinting out the front door and abandoning their equipment on my lawn. Alicia stood frozen in the center of the study. The arrogant sneer vanished from her face, replaced by absolute, unadulterated shock. She looked at the armed men, and then she looked at me. I stepped forward, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I told her that she had severely miscalculated my grief. I instructed the security team to remove the remaining intruders. The contractors grabbed the struggling orderlies by their scrubs and forcefully ejected them onto the driveway. The lead contractor then placed a firm, uncompromising hand on Alicia's shoulder, steering her toward the exit. She tried to scream threats about my mental state, but the heavy oak front door slammed shut in her face, cutting off her venomous words. The deadbolts clicked into place. The house was mine again. Dominic stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, having supervised the extraction from the perimeter. He gave a sharp nod of approval. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the true danger remained locked beneath my oak desk. We walked over to the heavy steel safe. Alicia had been desperate to extract it intact, believing it held her golden ticket. I knelt on the carpet and spun the cold metal dial, entering the complex combination only Naomi and I shared. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid clunk. I pulled the heavy door open and reached inside. I bypassed our property deeds and tax files, pulling out a pristine white legal folder that I had never placed there. I laid the folder flat on my desk and opened it under the bright reading lamp. Dominic stood over my shoulder as my trained eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. It was a comprehensive term life insurance policy. The principal payout was exactly $5 million. I stared at the signature line. The ink was a masterful forgery of my handwriting, undoubtedly facilitated by Rachel's executive access at the bank. The sole named beneficiary of the policy was my daughter Alicia. However, 30 years of forensic auditing taught me that the devil never hides in the headline figures. The devil lives in the fine print. I traced my finger down to Section 4, Clause B. It was a secondary contingency clause buried deep within the addendums. It stated that if the primary insured was legally declared mentally incompetent, incapacitated, or remanded to a psychiatric facility, the sole administration, control, and payout of the policy transferred entirely to the assigned legal conservator. That conservator was explicitly listed as Bradley. The sheer calculating evil of the plan crystallized in my mind. Bradley never intended to share this money with Alicia. He planned to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward using forged medical evaluations. Once I was legally stripped of my human rights, he would assume total control of my estate as my conservator. From there, it would be remarkably easy to arrange a quiet, fatal accident inside the underfunded medical facility. He would collect $5 million entirely tax-free. The severed brake lines on Naomi's car were not an isolated incident. They were the beta test for this exact moment. Naomi had died because she found this very document. Now Bradley was moving to close the loop. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Bradley was running a dual-layered execution strategy. Alicia believed she was orchestrating my commitment to secure her inheritance, completely blind to the fact that her husband had legally engineered the paperwork to cut her out entirely the moment my heart stopped beating. He was using her greed to facilitate my murder. Dominic tapped the forged signature on the page, his expression hardening into stone. He confirmed that corporate embezzlers rarely pivot to violent crime unless they are cornered, but But Bradley had crossed that threshold the moment he cut Naomi's brake lines. We were no longer dealing with a white-collar thief. We were dealing with an active serial killer who operated through legal loopholes and proxy assassins. I folded the insurance document and placed it securely next to Naomi's black ledger. The financial guillotine was primed and waiting to drop. A sudden violent pounding echoed through the house. Someone was hammering their fists against the reinforced front door. Dominic instinctively reached inside his tactical jacket, moving silently toward the security monitors mounted in the hallway. He tapped the screen, pulling up the live feed from the newly installed porch cameras. It was not Bradley, nor was it the local police. Standing on my welcome mat was a courier wearing a cheap windbreaker holding a thick, oversized legal envelope. I signaled to the security contractors to stand down. I walked to the door, disengaged the deadbolt, and opened it just enough to reach out. The courier shoved the envelope into my hand without a single word and sprinted back toward his idling car. I locked the door and ripped the heavy paper open. The document inside bore the official embossed seal of the state family court. It was an expedited ex parte emergency legal summons. Bradley had wasted no time after the incident at the Penthouse. He had unleashed his high-priced corporate legal team. The document was a formal petition demanding full and immediate legal guardianship over my person, my medical decisions, and my entire financial estate. He was legally moving to declare me dangerously psychotic. The bold red ink at the bottom of the summons dictated the timeline. The emergency hearing was scheduled in front of a county judge for 9 o'clock the very next morning. If I did not show up, or if I failed to prove my total sanity, Bradley would gain the absolute legal authority to sign my death warrant. The heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse sealed shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic noise of the morning city traffic. The courtroom inside was sterile, suffocating, and cold, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that cast long, unforgiving shadows across the polished mahogany benches. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was Bradley, dressed in an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit. Next to him sat my daughter Alicia. She was clutching a crumpled tissue to her face, playing the role of the traumatized, grieving daughter to absolute perfection. They had hired a high-priced corporate litigator, a man with a sharp, shark-like demeanor and a booming voice specifically designed to command judicial authority. The lawyer stood before the presiding judge and immediately launched into a carefully rehearsed, deeply tragic narrative. He painted a devastating picture of me, framing me as a broken, deeply unstable African-American elder who had completely lost his grip on reality following the sudden loss of his wife. He described the events of the previous afternoon with masterful, aggressive distortion. According to his version of events, I had suffered a violent psychotic break. I had aggressively assaulted a peaceful moving crew and violently attacked 2 innocent medical orderlies who were only there to offer compassionate medical assistance. He described how I had forcefully ejected my own weeping daughter from her childhood home, weaponizing my grief into uncontrollable physical rage. To cement this fabrication, the lawyer called their star witness to the stand. Dr. Eris Thorne, a private psychiatrist from a highly exclusive medical clinic, took the oath with smooth, practiced authority. He adjusted his expensive glasses and spoke with a tone of deep clinical concern. Doctor, Thorne testified that he had thoroughly reviewed my behavior and medical history over the past 48 hours. He confidently diagnosed me with acute aggressive grief-induced dementia. He looked directly at the judge and stated under oath that my cognitive decline was irreversible and rapidly accelerating. He insisted that I posed a severe and immediate physical danger to myself and my family. He formally recommended immediate involuntary institutionalization in a locked psychiatric facility, granting Bradley full legal conservatorship over my estate to manage my mounting medical costs. Bradley sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the table, masking his supreme confidence behind a look of solemn family duty. The judge turned her gaze toward me, her expression a mixture of professional authority and quiet pity. She asked if I had secured legal counsel to contest the emergency petition. I stood up slowly from the defendant's table. I buttoned my suit jacket and met her gaze with total unflinching composure. I informed the court that I was declining legal representation and would speak entirely for myself. A murmur rippled through the gallery, and Bradley's lawyer let out a short, dismissive scoff. They expected an unhinged rant. They expected a confused emotional outburst that would perfectly validate the psychiatrist's fabricated diagnosis. I gave them none of that. I leaned entirely on my 30 years of rigorous discipline investigating corporate fraud. I spent my entire adult life tearing apart cooked books, exposing phantom accounts, and sending arrogant executives to federal prison. I knew that numbers never lie, even when the people speaking them do. In a hostile boardroom, you never argue with the lie. You simply follow the money. I did not waste a single breath defending my sanity. Sanity is highly subjective in a courtroom setting. Certified bank records are absolute. I did not mention the moving crew, the physical confrontation, or the $5 million life insurance policy hidden in my safe. Instead, I picked up a single crisp manila folder from my table and walked deliberately toward the bench. I handed the folder to the bailiff, requesting it be submitted into the official court record. Inside was a certified, heavily encrypted wire transfer intercept that Dominic had retrieved during the early hours of the morning. As the judge opened the folder, I broke down the numbers aloud for the entire courtroom to hear. I detailed a highly secure offshore financial transaction. The document showed a transfer of exactly $25,000. The funds originated from a hidden corporate slush fund registered to Apex Corporation, an account entirely managed and controlled by Bradley in his capacity as chief financial officer. I directed the court's attention to the recipient of those stolen funds. The money had been routed directly into the private offshore banking account of Dr. Eris Thorne. I stated the exact timestamp of the transaction. The money had landed in the doctor's account precisely 48 hours ago, merely moments before he signed the emergency medical injunction to freeze my life savings. I stood before the judge and stated with absolute clarity that the court was not witnessing a medical evaluation today. The court was witnessing a purchased hit job. I explained that the psychiatric assessment was a fraudulent mechanism designed to strip me of my legal rights and facilitate the hostile takeover of my personal estate. The color instantly drained from Dr. Thorne's face. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, his practiced clinical authority completely collapsing into raw panic. Bradley's lawyer jumped to his feet, stammering wild objections about unverified evidence and procedural protocol, but the fatal damage was already done. The judge's demeanor shifted from sympathetic patience to absolute icy fury. The sharp crack of her wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot through the room, silencing the lawyer's frantic objections. She glared at the trembling psychiatrist on the stand, her voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising register. She immediately dismissed the guardianship petition with extreme prejudice, stating there was zero credible medical evidence to support the claim. She did not stop there. The judge ordered the bailiffs to detain Dr. Thorne inside the courtroom and formally instructed the district attorney's office to initiate an immediate criminal investigation into perjury, medical fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The sterile courtroom erupted into sudden, uncontrolled chaos. Bradley's high-priced lawyer frantically shoved documents into his briefcase, desperately trying to distance himself from the imploding conspiracy. The bailiffs moved swiftly toward the witness box, physically blocking the doctor from leaving the premises. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I turned my back on the chaos and walked down the center aisle, my posture rigid, dignified, and victorious. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the crowded, echoing hallway of the courthouse. The air was thick with the chatter of lawyers and nervous clients. Before I could reach the main exit, a hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around violently. It was Bradley. He had shoved past his own legal team and abandoned his wife to intercept me. His immaculate charcoal suit was wrinkled, his breathing heavy, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered malice. The mask of the grieving family man was permanently destroyed. He stepped completely into my personal space, leaning his face so close to mine that I could smell the bitter coffee on his breath. He made sure no one else in the crowded corridor could hear him. He whispered directly into my ear, his voice trembling with homicidal rage. "Your wife died screaming. You are next." Bradley's whispered promise of violence lingered in the cold air of the courthouse corridor long after he stormed away. He was a desperate man whose primary weapon of legal manipulation had just been publicly dismantled. Corporate predators, stripped of their legal cover, always revert to brute force to regain control. I knew my life was now in immediate physical danger. I did not return to my suburban home to wait for his next strike. I went entirely off the grid. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of my quiet residential street was violently broken. 4 men dressed in dark tactical gear and heavy ski masks approached the rear of my property. They bypassed the standard locks and shattered the reinforced glass of the back patio door with a single swing of a heavy steel sledgehammer. They poured into my living room, moving with a frantic, destructive energy. This was not a robbery. They did not carry bags to steal the silver or the electronics. This was a highly coordinated, targeted demolition. They systematically tore the house apart. Two men took heavy crowbars to the drywall, smashing massive, jagged holes into the plaster. They flipped the heavy oak dining table, shattering the antique crystal vase Naomi had purchased in Paris 20 years ago. They ripped the upholstery from the sofas, pulling the stuffing out in handfuls and scattering it across the hardwood floors. Once the physical destruction was complete, they moved to the psychological phase of Bradley's plan. One of the masked thugs pulled a can of black spray paint from his heavy duffel bag. He began writing incoherent, frantic ramblings across the pristine white walls. He painted sprawling, paranoid sentences about hidden enemies, stolen minds, and watching eyes. Their objective was brutally clear. Bradley needed to establish an undeniable crime scene that perfectly matched Dr. Thorne's fabricated psychiatric evaluation. He was staging the aftermath of a violent, catastrophic psychotic break. When the authorities arrived, they would find an elderly man who had seemingly lost his mind, destroyed his own home in a fit of grief-induced rage, and scrawled manic delusions on the walls. It was the absolute perfect justification to invoke a mandatory state-enforced 72-hour psychiatric hold. Once I was locked inside a state facility under the guise of an emergency intervention, Bradley would file a renewed motion for emergency conservatorship, and the court would hand him the keys to my life. 10 minutes after the thugs initiated their destruction, 3 local police cruisers rolled to a halt in front of my driveway. Their flashing red and blue lights illuminated the manicured lawn, but their sirens remained completely silent. Dominic had warned me that the precinct captain was securely nestled deep within Bradley's corporate payroll. The speed of their arrival proved his intel was flawless. The officers did not approach the house with the caution of a standard noise complaint. They emerged from their vehicles flanked by 2 burly paramedics carrying a heavy canvas straitjacket and a medical bag loaded with heavy sedatives. They were an extraction team bought and paid for, arriving perfectly on cue to haul a raving lunatic away to a locked ward. They kicked the front door open, their heavy boots crunching over the shattered glass. They swept through the destroyed living room, their flashlights piercing the darkness, shouting my name and ordering me to surrender. They checked the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the master bath. Their authoritative shouts quickly morphed into low, confused mutters. They stood in the center of the staged wreckage, entirely baffled. The house was completely devoid of human life. I was nowhere to be found. I was sitting in total darkness 2 blocks away. Dominic's unmarked surveillance van was parked discreetly under the heavy, sprawling branches of an old oak tree. The interior of the van glowed with the pale blue light of a dozen high-definition monitors. We had spent the entire afternoon rigging my property with military-grade night vision hidden cameras. I sat in a bolted leather chair, my hands resting calmly on the metal console, watching a live feed of the corrupt officers scratching their heads inside my ruined living room. I watched the masked thugs smash the framing of Naomi's favorite painting. I watched them deface the walls of the home I had worked 3 decades to pay off. It takes a supreme level of discipline to sit in silence and watch your sanctuary be desecrated. A younger, more foolish man would have stayed to fight, driven by pride and territorial instinct. But I was an auditor. I operated in the realm of long-term consequences. Intervening physically would have given the corrupt police the exact excuse they needed to arrest me for assault. Letting them destroy the house was a calculated sacrifice. Every shattered window and defaced wall was a high-resolution piece of digital evidence proving a coordinated criminal conspiracy. Bradley had just handed me the rope he would eventually hang from. On the far right monitor, the live feed tracked the 4 masked thugs sprinting out the back gate. They jogged down the narrow, unlit alleyway behind my property line, abandoning the staged crime scene. Dominic's fingers danced across the glowing keyboard, switching the main display to a discreet telephoto lens mounted inside a hollowed-out birdhouse facing the adjacent street. The camera captured the men piling into the back of a sleek silver luxury SUV parked in the shadows of a broken street lamp. The heavy engine hummed to life as the driver shifted into gear. I leaned forward, the pale blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I instructed Dominic to enhance the digital feed and zoom in tightly on the passenger side window. Dominic adjusted the focal length. The software sharpened the grainy night footage into crystal clear resolution. The passenger side window rolled down exactly 2 inches to let the cold night air in. The street lamp cast a brief illuminating glow into the interior of the vehicle. Sitting in the plush leather passenger seat was the coordinator of the strike team. She was gripping a burner phone, nodding in sharp approval as the thugs secured their sledgehammers in the back seat. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a dark, expensive trench coat over her bank uniform. It was Rachel. Bradley's corporate mistress and the corrupt vice president of my bank had not just frozen my accounts. She was personally overseeing the violent destruction of my life. I stared at the high-definition monitor illuminating the dark interior of the surveillance van. The image of Rachel's face burned itself into my retinas. The blonde woman sitting in the passenger seat of that getaway vehicle was the very same woman I had seen lounging in Bradley's penthouse wearing Naomi's silk robe. She was not merely a tragic cliché of corporate infidelity. She was an active, commanding participant in the violent destruction of my life. I instructed Dominic to cut the feed and get us out of the neighborhood. The local police would eventually figure out the house was empty and start expanding their perimeter to search for the raving madman they had been paid to detain. Dominic threw the van into gear, navigating the labyrinth of suburban back streets with the headlights completely extinguished until we reached the main arterial highway. We drove in complete silence for 40 minutes until we reached a desolate industrial storage facility on the edge of the city limits. The rusted metal gates parted just enough to let us through. Dominic swiped a keycard, pulling the heavy vehicle into a windowless concrete bay. He killed the engine. The silence was immediate and profound. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my coat and pulled out Naomi's black ledger. The worn leather cover felt warm against my fingertips. I placed it on the metal workbench situated in the corner of the garage. Dominic adjusted a high-intensity overhead lamp, bathing the cryptic pages in harsh white light. We began to cross-reference the routing numbers and coded abbreviations Naomi had meticulously documented against the public registry of corporate officers. My forensic accounting instincts took over entirely. The numbers told a story that human lips would never dare utter. It took exactly 20 minutes of intense cross-examination to uncover the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy. Rachel was the executive vice president of asset management at the exact regional banking institution holding my frozen retirement funds. The financial blockade Bradley had weaponized against me was not the result of a standard corporate policy or a bureaucratic error. It was a targeted inside job executed with surgical precision by his mistress. She possessed the high-level security clearance necessary to completely bypass the standard fraud prevention protocols. She personally authorized the freezing of my pension. She personally approved the transfer of my liquidated assets into Bradley's corporate slush funds. She was the vital artery pumping financial oxygen into his criminal enterprise. The sheer audacity of their partnership was breathtaking. I stepped back from the metal workbench, the harsh fluorescent light casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Hitting Bradley directly with this information would be a catastrophic tactical error. He was a multi-millionaire corporate titan completely insulated by high-priced legal teams and corrupt local law enforcement. If I went after him, he would simply sacrifice Rachel, claim ignorance, and use his vast resources to crush me in a prolonged legal battle. I had to cripple his infrastructure before I went for the head. I needed to completely sever his right arm. If Rachel fell, the financial blockade holding my assets hostage would crumble and Bradley would be exposed. I looked at Dominic, stating that we needed irrefutable proof of her specific banking violations, something far beyond the circumstantial evidence handwritten in the ledger. Dominic did not reply immediately. He simply reached across the workbench and picked up the heavy, matte black burner phone he had provided me at the train station. He held the device under the lamp and turned it over in his large, calloused hands. He explained that Naomi was not just a brilliant accountant. She possessed an unparalleled understanding of digital warfare and corporate espionage. Dominic pressed a complex 32-character sequence into the encrypted keypad. He did not unlock the phone's standard operating system. Instead, he triggered a hidden, deeply embedded digital partition. The screen flashed solid red for 3 seconds before loading a completely different user interface. It was a massive, heavily encrypted data cache. My mind instantly raced backward, piecing together the fragmented memories of the last 2 years. I remembered Naomi frequently traveling on long weekends, claiming she was attending tedious tax law seminars and corporate banking summits in offshore financial hubs. I remembered complaining that she was working too hard for a woman her age. She was not attending seminars, she was conducting active, high-level field reconnaissance. She had systematically infiltrated the digital infrastructure of Bradley's entire network. Dominic connected the burner phone to a secondary laptop he pulled from a heavy Pelican case. The screen populated with hundreds of hidden server logs, wire transfer intercepts, scanned offshore manifests, and heavily guarded corporate emails. Naomi had spent years quietly siphoning this massive volume of data, operating right under Bradley's arrogant nose, building an impenetrable arsenal of digital leverage. I leaned over the keyboard, my eyes scanning the endless rows of data with the hunger of a starving man. I instructed Dominic to filter the search parameters directly to Rachel's specific executive banking credentials. The software hummed rapidly, isolating a massive cluster of offshore financial routing protocols. The data cascaded across the bright screen, painting a picture of corruption so immense it defied basic logic. I isolated a specific series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I tracked the movement of the capital backward from the offshore accounts to the domestic deposits. The funds were not originating from Bradley's corporate real estate ventures. The money was flowing in from a massive, highly organized narcotics syndicate operating out of the southern border. Rachel was not merely embezzling corporate funds to buy luxury penthouses. She was actively using her executive banking authority to launder tens of millions of dollars in illicit drug cartel money through legitimate domestic real estate acquisitions. The documentation was absolutely flawless. Naomi had captured the exact digital signatures, the hidden IP addresses, and the specific timestamps, proving Rachel personally authorized every single dirty transaction. The cartel believed their money was securely integrated into the American financial system. If they discovered their primary financial architect had left a massive, glaring digital trail that could expose their entire network to federal authorities, their retaliation would be immediate and brutally final. I did not need to involve the corrupt local police precinct. I did not need to hire a lawyer to argue my case in a compromised civil court. I stood up from the workbench, a cold, rigid smile forming on my face. I instructed Dominic to compile the most damning pieces of evidence onto a secure, untraceable flash drive. I gathered a stack of heavy manila envelopes and pristine white mailing labels. I printed out the raw transaction logs, the undeniable proof of her sloppy digital footprint. I was going to bypass the American justice system entirely. I was going to drop an anonymous package directly into the hands of a cartel lieutenant and let the wolves devour each other. Bradley wanted to play games with my sanity, but I was about to introduce him to a level of violence his corporate lawyers could never litigate. I stared at the high-definition monitor illuminating the dark interior of the surveillance van. The image of Rachel's face burned itself into my retinas. The blonde woman sitting in the passenger seat of that getaway vehicle was the very same woman I had seen lounging in Bradley's penthouse wearing Naomi's silk robe. She was not merely a tragic cliché of corporate infidelity. She was an active, commanding participant in the violent destruction of my life. I instructed Dominic to cut the feed and get us out of the neighborhood. The local police would eventually figure out the house was empty and start expanding their perimeter to search for the raving madman they had been paid to detain. Dominic threw the van into gear, navigating the labyrinth of suburban backstreets with the headlights completely extinguished until we reached the main arterial highway. We drove in complete silence for 40 minutes until we reached a desolate industrial storage facility on the edge of the city limits. The rusted metal gates parted just enough to let us through. Dominic swiped a keycard, pulling the heavy vehicle into a windowless concrete bay. He killed the engine. The silence was immediate and profound. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my coat and pulled out Naomi's black ledger. The worn leather cover felt warm against my fingertips. I placed it on the metal workbench situated in the corner of the garage. Dominic adjusted a high-intensity overhead lamp, bathing the cryptic pages in harsh white light. We began to cross-reference the routing numbers and coded abbreviations Naomi had meticulously documented against the public registry of corporate officers. My forensic accounting instincts took over entirely. The numbers told a story that human lips would never dare utter. It took exactly 20 minutes of intense cross-examination to uncover the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy. Rachel was the executive vice president of asset management at the exact regional banking institution holding my frozen retirement funds. The financial blockade Bradley had weaponized against me was not the result of a standard corporate policy or a bureaucratic error. It was a targeted inside job executed with surgical precision by his mistress. She possessed the high-level security clearance necessary to completely bypass the standard fraud prevention protocols. She personally authorized the freezing of my pension. She personally approved the transfer of my liquidated assets into Bradley's corporate slush funds. She was the vital artery pumping financial oxygen into his criminal enterprise. The sheer audacity of their partnership was breathtaking. I stepped back from the metal workbench, the harsh fluorescent light casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Hitting Bradley directly with this information would be a catastrophic tactical error. He was a multimillionaire corporate titan completely insulated by high-priced legal teams and corrupt local law enforcement. If I went after him, he would simply sacrifice Rachel claim ignorance and use his vast resources to crush me in a prolonged legal battle. I had to cripple his infrastructure before I went for the head. I needed to completely sever his right arm. If Rachel fell, the financial blockade holding my assets hostage would crumble and Bradley would be exposed. I looked at Dominic, stating that we needed irrefutable proof of her specific banking violations, something far beyond the circumstantial evidence handwritten in the ledger. Dominic did not reply immediately. He simply reached across the workbench and picked up the heavy, matte black burner phone he had provided me at the train station. He held the device under the lamp and turned it over in his large, calloused hands. He explained that Naomi was not just a brilliant accountant. She possessed an unparalleled understanding of digital warfare and corporate espionage. Dominic pressed a complex 32-character sequence into the encrypted keypad. He did not unlock the phone's standard operating system. Instead, he triggered a hidden, deeply embedded digital partition. The screen flashed solid red for 3 seconds before loading a completely different user interface. It was a massive, heavily encrypted data cache. My mind instantly raced backward, piecing together the fragmented memories of the last 2 years. I remembered Naomi frequently traveling on long weekends, claiming she was attending tedious tax law seminars and corporate banking summits in offshore financial hubs. I remembered complaining that she was working too hard for a woman her age. She was not attending seminars. She was conducting active, high-level field reconnaissance. She had systematically infiltrated the digital infrastructure of Bradley's entire network. Dominic connected this burner phone to a secondary laptop he pulled from a heavy Pelican case. The screen populated with hundreds of hidden server logs, wire transfer intercepts, scanned offshore manifests, and heavily guarded corporate emails. Naomi had spent years quietly siphoning this massive volume of data, operating right under Bradley's arrogant nose, building an impenetrable arsenal of digital leverage. I leaned over the keyboard, my eyes scanning the endless rows of data with the hunger of a starving man. I instructed Dominic to filter the search parameters directly to Rachel's specific executive banking credentials. The software hummed rapidly, isolating a massive cluster of offshore financial routing protocols. The data cascaded across the bright screen, painting a picture of corruption so immense it defied basic logic. I isolated a specific series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I tracked the movement of the capital backward from the offshore accounts to the domestic deposits. The funds were not originating from Bradley's corporate real estate ventures. The money was flowing in from a massive, highly organized narcotics syndicate operating out of the southern border. Rachel was not merely embezzling corporate funds to buy luxury penthouses. She was actively using her executive banking authority to launder tens of millions of dollars in illicit drug cartel money through legitimate domestic real estate acquisitions. The documentation was absolutely flawless. Naomi had captured the exact digital signatures, the hidden IP addresses, and the specific timestamps proving Rachel personally authorized every single dirty transaction. The cartel believed their money was securely integrated into the American financial system. If they discovered their primary financial architect had left a massive, glaring digital trail that could expose their entire network to federal authorities, their retaliation would be immediate and brutally final. I did not need to involve the corrupt local police precinct. I did not need to hire a lawyer to argue my case in a compromised civil court. I stood up from the workbench, a cold, rigid smile forming on my face. I instructed Dominic to compile the most damning pieces of evidence onto a secure, untraceable flash drive. I gathered a stack of heavy manila envelopes and pristine white mailing labels. I printed out the raw transaction logs, the undeniable proof of her sloppy digital footprint. I was going to bypass the American justice system entirely. I was going to drop an anonymous package directly into the hands of a cartel lieutenant and let the wolves devour each other. Bradley wanted to play games with my sanity, but I was about to introduce him to a level of violence his corporate lawyers could never litigate. I sat in the dim light of the industrial storage bay, staring at the raw data compiled on the encrypted flash drive. The local police precinct was a compromised entity functioning as nothing more than a private security firm for Bradley's corporate interests. Handing them this magnitude of evidence would guarantee its immediate destruction and likely result in a fatal accident for Dominic and myself. I had to aim much higher. I looked at Dominic and instructed him to establish a secure, multi-layered proxy connection. He nodded, his fingers moving rapidly across the illuminated keyboard, bouncing our digital signal through dozens of international servers to ensure our physical location remained absolutely untraceable. I took the raw transaction logs, the offshore manifestos, and the undeniable proof of Rachel's cartel money laundering, and I compiled them into a single devastating digital payload. I did not include any personal grievances. I did not mention Naomi, the forged life insurance policy, or the staged vandalism at my home. The federal authorities did not care about a suburban family dispute. They cared about systemic multi-million-dollar financial crimes committed on American soil. I addressed the first encrypted package directly to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I addressed the second identical package to the Internal Ethics and Regulatory Board of Rachel's banking institution. Firing both arrows simultaneously was a critical strategic maneuver. The bank's board of directors would immediately attempt to bury the scandal to protect their stock prices, but they could not sweep it under the rug if the federal government was already knocking on their front door. The FBI would move with overwhelming force, and the bank would be forced to completely disavow Rachel to save themselves. I hovered my finger over the execution command on the keyboard. I thought about the sheer arrogance Rachel displayed while lounging in my deceased wife's silk robe. I pressed the key. The progress bar flashed across the screen, reaching 100% in less than 4 seconds. The files were permanently out in the wild. The digital guillotine had been released. There was no reversing the transmission. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and listened to the low hum of the cooling fans on Dominic's server rack. The silent execution was complete. Now we simply had to wait for the explosive consequences to detonate across the city. Dominic tapped a new command into his console, hijacking the internal closed-circuit security feeds of the regional banking headquarters. We watched the high-definition monitors as the morning business hours commenced. Rachel sat at the head of a massive mahogany table inside the glass-walled executive suite surrounded by senior partners and wealth managers. She wore a tailored designer suit projecting absolute invulnerability and corporate dominance. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire financial empire had been dismantled 3 hours prior. At precisely 10 o'clock, a convoy of unmarked black tactical vehicles swarmed the plaza outside the bank. Heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the FBI insignia poured through the revolving glass doors. They did not stop at the reception desk or ask for permission to enter the restricted floors. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, bypassing the building's private security personnel entirely. Dominic zoomed the camera feed tightly onto the executive suite. The glass doors of the boardroom were violently shoved open. Rachel stood up, her mouth open in a shout of indignation, demanding to know the meaning of the intrusion. The lead federal agent did not hesitate. He slammed her face first onto the polished mahogany table, scattering her pristine financial portfolios. He wrenched her arms behind her back and locked heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The surrounding corporate executives scrambled backward, their faces pale with absolute terror as the agents began seizing laptops, hard drives, and physical ledgers. Rachel was dragged out of the boardroom in front of her peers. Her designer suit rumpled, her mask of untouchable arrogance completely shattered. The internal fallout was instantaneous. The moment the FBI breached the executive floor, the bank's automated regulatory protocols were triggered. The ethics board, having received my encrypted dossier, instantly moved to isolate the infection. Rachel's executive credentials were unequivocally revoked. Her access codes were permanently deleted from the mainframe. Her digital signature was instantly invalidated. I opened my personal laptop on the metal workbench and logged into my secure retirement portal. The financial blockade she had weaponized against me was legally tied to her specific administrative authority. With her credentials destroyed, the fraudulent freezes collapsed like a house of cards. I watched the screen intently as the red restrictive banners vanished from my dashboard. My pension funds repopulated. My liquidated assets snapped back into my direct control. My entire financial war chest was completely restored in a matter of seconds. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the crushing weight of financial paralysis lift from my shoulders. Bradley had used his mistress to cut off my oxygen. I had just severed his right arm. He was now financially exposed and entirely vulnerable to a direct assault. The sudden sharp tone of an incoming audio intercept broke the silence of the storage bay. Dominic had planted a sophisticated digital wiretap on Alicia's personal cell phone immediately following the staged vandalism at my house. He tapped the glowing green audio wave on his monitor, broadcasting the intercepted phone call through the van's high-fidelity speakers. Bradley's voice echoed through the metal bay, but the smooth, calculating corporate tone was entirely gone. He was breathing heavily, his words rushed and completely frantic. Alicia asked him what was happening, her voice high-pitched and laced with fresh panic. She told him that she had just seen the news alerts about the federal raid at the bank and Rachel's high-profile arrest. Bradley ignored her questions entirely. He did not offer reassurances or formulate a legal defense strategy. He sounded like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut around his neck. He told Alicia that the federal authorities were seizing Rachel's entire offshore network and that the digital trail would inevitably lead straight back to his corporate holding companies. He gripped the phone, his voice dropping into a raspy, terrified whisper. He explicitly stated that the only way the feds could have obtained that specific level of offshore routing data was if someone had decrypted Naomi's black ledger. He realized his colossal miscalculation. The frail, grieving old man he had been trying to institutionalize was holding the ultimate weapon. Bradley's voice trembled with raw, unadulterated fear as he delivered his final command. He told his wife that I possessed her mother's shadow files and that the containment strategy had completely failed. He declared that they had to terminate me tonight permanently and without hesitation before the feds looked his way. I needed to make myself bait. Dominic strongly advised against this maneuver, urging me to let his private security contractors establish a defensive perimeter around the storage facility. I completely rejected his advice. Bradley was operating purely on adrenaline and raw desperation. If I flooded my immediate zone with armed mercenaries, my son-in-law would simply retreat into the shadows. He would regroup, leverage his remaining offshore accounts, and hire a professional ghost to shoot me through a window a month from now. I had to draw him out into the open and force a final definitive encounter tonight. I drove my sedan to a desolate 24-hour grocery store situated on the decaying industrial edge of the city limits. The sprawling parking lot was a sea of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds illuminated only by a few flickering sodium vapor street lamps. It was the absolute perfect stage for a violent, untraceable mugging. I entered the store, purchased a small paper bag of useless groceries, and walked slowly back to my vehicle. I deliberately dragged my feet, projecting the image of a defeated, highly vulnerable target. I heard the low, stealthy hum of a high-performance engine long before I saw the vehicle. A dark, luxury SUV glided silently into the row behind me, immediately cutting its headlights to blend into the darkness. I navigated toward a deep blind spot wedged between two rusted, abandoned utility vans. Heavy footsteps echoed rapidly on the wet pavement behind me. I turned around slowly. Bradley stood blocking the narrow exit. The immaculate, untouchable corporate titan was entirely gone. He wore a dark, unbranded hoodie. His face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were wide and dilated with absolute homicidal panic. In his right hand, he gripped a sleek black pistol equipped with a heavy cylindrical suppressor. He raised the weapon, his hand trembling with the weight of his intentions. He informed me that I had left him no choice. He blamed me entirely for Rachel's federal arrest and the imminent collapse of his financial empire. He clearly outlined his strategy. He planned to shoot me directly in the chest, steal my wallet, and leave my body behind the vans for the morning shift to discover. He was going to frame my execution as another tragic, fatal mugging in a bad neighborhood. Bradley commanded me to hand over the flash drives containing Naomi's shadow files. I did not argue with him. I did not attempt to reason with a cornered executive holding a loaded weapon. Instead, I let my breathing hitch violently. I clutched my chest with my left hand, contorting my face into a mask of sudden, agonizing pain. I dropped the heavy paper grocery bag. Glass jars shattered and loose fruit rolled across the wet pavement. I dropped heavily to one knee, gasping loudly, playing the role of a frail elder experiencing a catastrophic cardiac event induced by extreme terror. Bradley sneered. His corporate arrogance completely overrode his basic tactical sense. He wanted to revel in his victory. He wanted to look directly down into my eyes as I died. He took 3 large steps forward, invading my immediate physical space, pointing the suppressed barrel directly at my forehead. He severely miscalculated my history. Long before I was a meticulous corporate auditor, I was an infantryman. 50 years ago, I survived brutal close-quarters combat in the suffocating heat of a foreign jungle. You do not survive that hostile environment without forging violent muscle memory that permanently alters your central nervous system. I spent my entire adult life wearing tailored suits, tearing apart cooked books, and projecting the demeanor of a harmless accountant. But the spreadsheet auditor was merely a mask. The veteran never truly left. I did not reach for the gun. I pivoted my weight firmly onto my left foot and swung my heavy oak walking cane in a vicious horizontal arc. I drove the solid brass base of the cane directly into the side of Bradley's left kneecap. The joint shattered with a sickening, audible crack that echoed sharply between the metal vans. Bradley let out a high-pitched shriek of pure, unfiltered agony. His leg buckled completely, throwing his entire body off balance. As he pitched forward into the darkness, I brought the heavy wooden shaft of the cane straight up in a brutal vertical strike. The dense oak connected squarely with the underside of his jaw. The massive impact snapped his head back instantly, scrambling his equilibrium and disarming him. The suppressed pistol flew from his grip and clattered loudly across the asphalt, sliding safely out of reach. Bradley crashed hard into the spilled groceries, weeping uncontrollably and clutching his ruined leg. I stood silently over the architect of my wife's murder. I did not offer a grand, triumphant speech. I did not waste my breath lecturing him about the sanctity of family or the cost of his betrayal. I simply stepped over his writhing body and kicked the suppressed pistol deep underneath the chassis of the adjacent utility van, placing the weapon completely out of his reach. I knelt beside him, entirely ignoring his pathetic sobs. I reached into the pocket of his dark hoodie and extracted his smartphone. The device was currently unlocked, the screen glowing brightly in the darkness of the alleyway. I secured the phone inside my heavy winter coat, turned my back on my son-in-law, and walked away. As I approached my sedan, the stolen device vibrated aggressively against my ribs. I pulled it out and stared at the illuminated screen. It was an incoming message from a highly encrypted anonymous number. The sender did not use a name. The words burned themselves into my mind, shifting the entire paradigm of the conspiracy. Bradley was not the one who crawled under Naomi's vehicle. He was merely the paymaster. The message read exactly as follows. Brake lines were easy. Give the word and the old man is done. I walked away from the groans echoing between the utility vans and returned to my sedan. I drove with mechanical precision back to the industrial storage facility where Dominic had parked the surveillance van. My hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but a heavy, suffocating weight settled deep within my chest. The glowing text message on Bradley's stolen device provided the final, undeniable confirmation of my wife's murder. Naomi did not lose control on a treacherous curve due to a tragic mechanical failure. She was hunted. She was assassinated by a paid professional because she possessed the intelligence to uncover a massive corporate conspiracy. A profound, searing grief threatened to paralyze my respiratory system. I forced the emotion down into a tightly sealed vault within my mind. Grief is a luxury reserved for those who are safe. I was an active target, and my wife's killer was currently waiting for a digital command to end my life. I stepped into the dimly lit interior of the surveillance van and tossed Bradley's unlocked smartphone onto the metal workbench. Dominic looked at the glowing screen, reading the chilling text message regarding the severed brake lines. His jaw tightened into a rigid line. He immediately connected the stolen device to his primary server array. Bradley was a creature of corporate comfort, arrogant enough to believe his wealth made him digitally invincible. He had not instituted a secondary biometric lock or a remote wipe protocol. Dominic bypassed the standard encryption layers in under 4 minutes. The hidden applications unspooled across the high-definition monitors. We were looking at a highly specialized, decentralized messaging network designed for untraceable illicit transactions. The auditor within me recognized the architecture. It was identical to the offshore banking portals Rachel had utilized to funnel cartel money. Dominic deployed a rapid packet-sniffing algorithm, isolating the specific signal pinging from the hitman's active connection. The digital hunter tracked the invisible breadcrumbs bouncing across cellular towers. The software mapped the data packets, narrowing the geographical radius with ruthless efficiency. A bright red coordinate locked onto the digital map, illuminating the screen. The hitman was not hiding in a fortified compound or an offshore sanctuary. The IP address traced directly to a cheap, decaying motel situated on the desolate outskirts of the city limits. The killer was local, armed, and actively awaiting his final payment. I stared at the blinking red cursor on the map. The assassin was less than 15 miles away, resting comfortably in a derelict motel room while he waited for the authorization to put a bullet in my head. I knew confronting a seasoned contract killer in an unpredictable environment was a tactical death sentence. He would have the motel room wired, the exits monitored, and the sightlines perfectly calculated. I needed to pry him out of his fortified position. I needed to drag him into a designated kill box where Dominic and I controlled every possible variable. I pulled the keyboard toward me, my fingers hovering over the keys. I had to become Bradley. I had to perfectly emulate the frantic, demanding tone of a cornered corporate executive who was rapidly losing control of his meticulously engineered criminal empire. Bradley was a coward who hid behind layers of expensive lawyers and proxy violence. A man like that would be terrified by the sudden collapse of his financial shields and the impending threat of a federal investigation. He would demand immediate closure. I opened the encrypted messaging thread and began to type. I did not use full sentences or proper punctuation. I mimicked the panicked, rushed cadence of a man whose kneecap had just been shattered in a grocery store parking lot. I typed a frantic message stating that the entire situation had deteriorated into absolute chaos. I claimed that the federal authorities were closing in on the banking operations and that the old man was actively moving to expose the entire syndicate. I insisted that the execution could no longer wait for a convenient window of opportunity. The hit had to happen tonight. I demanded an urgent in-person meeting to facilitate the final transaction. I stated that I had withdrawn $100,000 in untraceable, non-sequential bills to cover the immediate termination of the target. To bait the hook properly, I knew I had to appeal to the hitman's professional paranoia. I wrote that the city was crawling with federal agents and local police due to the bank raid. I insisted that the exchange could not take place at the motel or in any public sector. The drop location had to be an absolutely secure, highly elevated, and entirely untraceable environment. I hit send. The encrypted application confirmed the delivery. The raid receipt illuminated instantly. The hitman was awake, staring at his screen, processing the frantic demands of his wealthy employer. Dominic stood silently behind my chair, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm. We were broadcasting a massive vulnerability, inviting a professional killer to dictate the terms of engagement. But it was a calculated risk built on 30 years of analyzing human greed. The promise of a massive, immediate cash payout would override the assassin's standard operational protocols. He would want the money tonight, and he would want to secure it in a location where he felt tactically superior. We waited in the cold, humming silence of the surveillance van, watching the empty chat bubble pulse on the monitor. The seconds dragged into minutes, stretching the tension inside the metal storage bay to an agonizing degree. My eyes remained fixed on the glowing white screen. I refused to let my focus waver. The hitman was analyzing the sudden shift in the operational timeline. He was calculating the risk of an emergency cash drop against the massive financial reward I had just dangled in front of him. Contract killers operated strictly on a foundation of leverage and control. He would never accept a meeting place chosen by a panicked, unraveling corporate executive. He would dictate the rendezvous point to ensure he held the ultimate tactical advantage over his employer. The heavy black smartphone vibrated violently against the metal surface of the workbench. A new encrypted data packet materialized on the high-definition monitor. The chat bubble expanded, rendering a single horrifying line of text. The blood instantly froze in my veins. The message confirmed a level of depravity that transcended standard contract violence. It was a vicious, taunting reminder of the exact moment my entire world had been brutally dismantled. The assassin did not hesitate, nor did he ask for clarification regarding the cash. He simply established the terms of the final encounter. The response read exactly as follows. Same place we celebrated the wife's crash. Meet me at the Penthouse. I stared at the glowing letters, the sheer malice of the words burning into my consciousness. They had celebrated her death. They had stood high above the city skyline, clinking expensive crystal glasses and toasting the successful murder of the woman I loved. I pushed the keyboard away and stood up from the leather chair. The auditor was done. The veteran was taking over. I looked at Dominic, confirming our next destination. We left the industrial storage bay and navigated back into the heart of the city, moving entirely under the cover of darkness. The Penthouse was a modern fortress of glass and steel, heavily guarded by private security patrols and biometric scanners. Dominic did not view this as an obstacle. He bypassed the building's main lobby, entirely guiding us through the subterranean service tunnels using an encrypted keycard he had cloned off a maintenance supervisor weeks ago. We rode the freight elevator in absolute silence, ascending directly to the top floor. Dominic disabled the primary alarm system on the penthouse door with a compact electronic decryptor in less than 30 seconds. We stepped inside the massive living room where Bradley had so arrogantly celebrated my wife's tragic death. The space was immaculate, featuring sprawling floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing city skyline. It was the ultimate symbol of his corporate conquest and stolen wealth. I intended to turn his pristine sanctuary into a digital execution chamber. We had exactly 3 hours before the hitman was scheduled to arrive for his payment. Dominic opened his heavy Pelican case and immediately went to work. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, embedding high-definition micro-cameras inside the overhead ventilation grates and behind the expensive modern art installations hanging on the walls. He wired ultra-sensitive audio transmitters underneath the heavy marble coffee table and inside the base of the designer floor lamps. He did not rely on local storage. He linked every single feed directly to a secure external server farm located 3,000 miles away. Whatever happened in this room tonight would be permanently recorded, instantly uploaded, and entirely beyond Bradley's ability to manipulate or destroy. I stood by the glass wall looking out over the sleeping city. I thought about Naomi falling from that treacherous coastal road. I locked the grief away, focusing entirely on the mission. I swept the room, my auditor's mind cataloging every detail of Bradley's lavish lifestyle, searching for any physical evidence he might have carelessly left behind in his domain. My eyes traced the sleek, custom mahogany paneling lining the far wall of the study area. 30 years of forensic accounting teaches you to look for disruptions in established patterns. The human eye easily glides over uniformity, but a trained mind catches the slightest deviation. I noticed a microscopic misalignment in the wood grain near the floorboard. The gap was less than a millimeter wider than the surrounding seams. I approached the wall and ran my fingers along the smooth edge. I applied firm pressure to the wooden panel. It shifted inward with a soft click, popping open to reveal a hidden biometric wall safe. Bradley believed his secret compartment was invisible. He severely underestimated a husband who knew his wife's habits and a father who understood his son-in-law's paranoia. I stared at the keypad. Naomi had despised complex digital passwords, always favoring foundational dates. I punched in the numerical sequence of our wedding anniversary. The light on the safe flashed green and the heavy steel door swung open. Inside the dark cavity rested a single sealed legal envelope bearing the emblem of a prestigious downtown law firm. I pulled it out and broke the wax seal. I unfolded the thick parchment under the dim light of the desk lamp. It was Naomi's authentic last will and testament, dated exactly 4 days before her fatal crash. As I read the carefully typed paragraphs, the sheer magnitude of my wife's intelligence and foresight crystallized. Naomi had completely uncovered Bradley's financial laundering and Alicia's complicity long before I did. The first page of the document explicitly and unequivocally disinherited our daughter. Alicia was stripped of every single asset, property, and trust fund. Naomi had legally transferred our entire accumulated wealth into a locked, impenetrable charitable foundation dedicated to protecting elderly victims of financial abuse. But the true power of the envelope rested on the second page. It was a fully notarized, signed affidavit. In her own words, Naomi detailed the exact mechanics of Bradley's offshore cartel laundering operation. She named the shell companies, listed the fraudulent routing numbers, and outlined his plan to isolate and institutionalize me. This was the document that got her killed. Bradley had discovered she drafted this will and murdered her before she could officially file it with the state courts. He then replaced it with the forged documents granting him full conservatorship. I held my wife's final act of defiance in my hands. She had fought to protect me until her last breath. I carefully placed the authentic will inside my coat pocket, resting it right next to her black ledger. A sharp electronic chime echoed suddenly through the silent penthouse. The digital deadbolt on the main entrance clicked loudly, signaling an authorized entry. Dominic instantly dropped to a crouch, his hand gripping the butt of his suppressed sidearm, and melted into the deep shadows behind the large leather sofa. I stepped backward, pressing my body flat against the dark mahogany paneling of the hallway corridor. We braced for the immediate arrival of the cartel hitman. We fully expected a hardened tactical killer walking into the room to collect his final bounty for murdering my wife. The heavy oak door swung inward, casting a long, sharp shadow across the polished marble foyer. The figure that stepped into the penthouse was not a professional assassin. She wore a dark trench coat and moved with frantic, jerky, uncoordinated steps. She slammed the door shut behind her and leaned heavily against the frame, breathing in ragged gasps as if she had just sprinted up the service stairwell. It was my daughter, Alicia. Her eyes darted around the empty living room wide with absolute uncontrolled terror. The arrogant corporate predator who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward just hours prior was completely gone. Her manicured hands tightly gripped the thick canvas straps of a massive, heavy duffel bag. The dark fabric bulged drastically under the immense weight of its contents. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, analyzing her defensive posture and the undeniable shape of the bag. Alicia had brought the $100,000 in cash to personally pay the hitman. The sudden illumination of the penthouse was blinding. Dominic tapped a single command on his mobile interface, and the automated smart lighting system engaged, instantly flooding the sprawling living room with harsh, high-intensity light. Alicia shrieked violently, recoiling from the sudden blast. The heavy canvas straps of the duffel bag slipped from her trembling fingers. The bag slammed against the polished marble floor with a dense, heavy thud. The zipper burst open just enough to reveal thick-banded stacks of $100 bills spilling out onto the stone. She threw her hands over her face, bracing herself, fully expecting to be gunned down by the cartel assassin she had come to pay. I stepped completely out of the shadows of the mahogany corridor, letting my heavy winter coat fall open. I did not hold a weapon. I simply leaned my weight onto my oak walking cane and stared at the woman I had raised from birth. It took Alicia exactly 4 seconds to process the tactical shift in the room. Her eyes darted wildly, taking in my presence, the lack of a masked killer, and the absolute silence of the penthouse. The raw animal terror in her expression evaporated. In its place, a rapid, deeply ingrained survival mechanism took over. 30 years ago, when she broke a neighbor's window or stole cash from my wallet, she would deploy this exact same defense. She would instantly cast herself as the helpless, misunderstood victim of circumstance. I watched the transformation happen with clinical detachment. Her shoulders slumped. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. She dropped to her knees right beside the spilled fortune of blood money, burying her face in her hands. The sobbing started immediately. It was loud, chaotic, and perfectly pitched to tear at a father's heartstrings. She wailed my name, rocking back and forth on the hard marble, presenting an image of total, shattering despair. She believed the act would work because it had always worked. For her entire life, I had shielded her from the consequences of her actions. I had paid her debts, excused her arrogance, and blamed her flaws on my own failings as a parent. She was banking her survival on the assumption that paternal love was blind to absolute evil. Alicia crawled forward across the cold floor, reaching out with manicured hands to grasp the fabric of my trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to grab nothing but empty air. She looked up at me, her face streaked with perfectly engineered tears, her mascara running down her cheeks to complete the illusion of a broken woman. She launched into her desperate narrative without waiting for me to ask a single question. She claimed Bradley was a monster. She swore he had physically abused her in secret for years, controlling her every move and isolating her from our family. Her voice pitched into a frantic, pleading register as she pointed a shaking finger at the heavy duffel bag. She insisted she had no idea what the money was actually for. Bradley had simply forced her to pack the cash and deliver it to the penthouse under the threat of severe violence. She framed the situation as a terrifying errand for a domestic tyrant, claiming she thought she was paying off a corporate blackmailer or a disgruntled real estate partner. She swore on her life that she had absolutely zero knowledge of any plot against my life. She invoked Naomi's name repeatedly, weeping loudly about how much she missed her mother. She cried that the grief of losing Naomi had left her vulnerable and completely unable to resist Bradley's aggressive commands. She begged me to protect her. She called me Daddy, using the childhood nickname she had abandoned a decade ago. She painted herself as a hostage trapped in a golden cage, desperate for her father to rescue her from a criminal mastermind. It was a masterful, Oscar-worthy performance. If I had not spent the last several hours cross-referencing offshore banking routes and tracking hitmen, I might have fallen to my knees and pulled her into my arms. I might have believed that my daughter was simply a tragic pawn caught in the crossfire of Bradley's corporate greed. But the forensic accountant in me was currently analyzing the structural integrity of her lies. She was too perfectly styled for a woman living in constant fear of physical abuse. Her timeline regarding the cash drop completely contradicted the frantic, encrypted message Bradley had sent just an hour ago from the grocery store parking lot. Bradley did not force her to make this drop. She had intercepted his communications, realized the plan was collapsing, and taken the initiative to pay the killer herself to ensure the loose ends were permanently severed. She was not a hostage. She was the primary architect. I looked down at my daughter with eyes entirely devoid of warmth. I did not feel rage, nor did I feel the crushing weight of a broken heart. I felt nothing but the cold, sterile clarity of a completed audit. The numbers were balanced. The truth was absolute. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. Dominic had successfully mirrored the entire audio cache from the hidden partition on Bradley's burner device. I did not offer Alicia a single word of rebuttal or comfort. I simply tapped the screen. The room's high-fidelity surround sound system, which Dominic had commandeered upon our entry, broadcast the audio file with crystal-clear, undeniable acoustic precision. The recording echoed sharply off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ensure her car goes over the ravine. That bitch is planning to cut my trust fund." It was Alicia's voice. It was not trembling with fear, nor was it coerced. It was sharp, venomous, and dripping with calculated malice. She had ordered her own mother's execution over a financial dispute. The effect of the audio playback was instantaneous and profoundly disturbing. Alicia stopped crying immediately. The violent sobs did not taper off into sniffles. They cut out completely, as if a physical switch had been flipped inside her brain. She slowly lowered her hands from her face and stood up from the marble floor. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her trench coat with mechanical precision. The tears on her cheeks dried instantly. The helpless, terrified victim vanished into thin air. Her face turned to absolute stone, her eyes locking onto mine with the cold, dead stare of an apex predator realizing the hunt was over. I held my gaze steady, meeting the cold, dead stare of the woman I had raised. The biological connection between us evaporated in the sterile air of the penthouse. The daughter who had once scraped her knees in our driveway and cried on my shoulder over high school heartbreaks was a phantom. The entity standing before me was a parasite entirely consumed by greed and devoid of basic human empathy. She had orchestrated the violent execution of her own mother to protect a trust fund. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I operated with the absolute clinical precision of an auditor finalizing a terminal ledger. I lifted my right foot and drove the heavy heel of my shoe directly into the center of the canvas duffel bag. The impact sent the heavy bag sliding violently across the polished marble floor. It crashed against the base of the sprawling glass wall, the remaining stacks of $100 bills spilling out into a chaotic pile. The physical distance I put between us mirrored the permanent, unbridgeable chasm that now separated our lives. The illusion of our family was permanently dead. Alicia tracked the movement of the money with hungry, desperate eyes before snapping her attention back to me. Her mind raced desperately, calculating a new vector of manipulation. She opened her mouth, her facial muscles twitching as she prepared to formulate another elaborate lie or perhaps launch a physical threat. She never got the chance to speak a single word. The heavy oak door of the penthouse swung open with a violent, resounding crash that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The sudden noise shattered the tense standoff. Alicia flinched, her predator mask cracking as she spun toward the entryway. I did not move. I remained firmly planted in the shadows of the mahogany corridor, my hand tightly gripping the brass head of my walking cane. Dominic remained perfectly concealed behind the leather sofa, a silent guardian waiting for the operational trigger. We watched the foyer as the true architect of this disaster finally arrived at his designated kill box. Bradley dragged himself into the room. He leaned heavily on a thick aluminum medical crutch, his left leg encased in a rigid temporary brace. The immaculate corporate titan was a bruised, broken shell of a man. The left side of his jaw was swollen and violently discolored purple from the brutal strike I had delivered in the grocery store parking lot just hours ago. He was sweating profusely, panting with the extreme physical exertion required to navigate the service elevator and the hallway. But he was not alone. Walking a step behind him, moving with the terrifying silent grace of an apex predator, was a towering man clad in a dark tactical jacket. The hitman possessed cold, professional eyes that instantly scanned the perimeter of the living room, analyzing the sightlines and the structural layout. He radiated an aura of practiced, lethal efficiency. Bradley leaned heavily on his crutch, his chest heaving as he took in the scene before him. He saw the spilled duffel bag of cash against the window. He saw Alicia standing frozen in the center of the room. He saw me waiting in the shadows. A deep, manic laugh erupted from Bradley's ruined jaw. The sound was wet, ragged, and completely devoid of sanity. The immense pressure of the federal bank raid, the loss of his offshore accounts, and the physical agony of his shattered kneecap had completely fractured his psychological foundation. He pieced the narrative together instantly. He realized that Alicia had drained their remaining domestic cash reserves to intercept the hitman and buy her own way out of the collapsing conspiracy. She was trying to secure her survival at his expense. Bradley's twisted laughter echoed off the glass walls, a chilling symphony of absolute desperation. He stopped laughing and leveled a shaking, hate-filled glare at his wife. He declared that she was a traitor, a pathetic liability who lacked the stomach for genuine corporate warfare. He turned his attention to me, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. He boasted that my digital tricks and federal alerts were utterly useless now. He believed he had reclaimed the ultimate tactical advantage by bringing the instrument of execution directly into the room. Bradley turned his head slightly toward the towering man in the tactical jacket. He issued a sharp, definitive command. He ordered the hitman to execute us both immediately. Bradley meticulously outlined his strategy aloud, scripting the aftermath of the massacre for the local police. He instructed the killer to shoot Alicia first, then place the weapon in my dead hand. He was going to stage the scene as a catastrophic, violent murder-suicide. The narrative would state that a grieving, mentally unstable father discovered his daughter's complicity in her mother's death and snapped, killing her before turning the gun on himself. It was a vile, brilliantly insulated lie. It would permanently silence the only two people capable of connecting him to Naomi's assassination and the offshore money laundering. Bradley leaned on his crutch, his bruised face stretching into a triumphant, grotesque smile as he demanded the hitman finish the job. The air in the massive penthouse grew heavy and utterly suffocating. The towering man in the tactical jacket stepped forward, closing the distance between the entryway and the center of the living room. His movements were fluid and entirely devoid of hesitation. He reached under the heavy fabric of his jacket. The sharp metallic click of a round chambering into the breech of a high-caliber handgun echoed with terrifying clarity. Alicia let out a piercing shriek of genuine terror. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble, throwing her hands over her head and curling into a tight defensive ball, weeping uncontrollably as she waited for the fatal impact. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my eyes locked on the approaching killer. Bradley's triumphant smile widened, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of his ultimate victory. He braced himself against the crutch, eager to witness the bloody resolution of his collapsing empire. The hitman raised his arm, the dark steel of the weapon catching the harsh overhead light. He moved with absolute, terrifying purpose, but he did not aim at Alicia. He ignored me entirely. The hitman halted his advance. He pivoted sharply on his heavy combat boots, shifting his entire body weight in a single, seamless motion. He swung his arm in a tight upward arc. He drove the cold, suppressed barrel of the heavy handgun directly against the center of Bradley's bruised forehead. The cold, unforgiving metal of the suppressor pressed deeply into the bruised flesh of Bradley's forehead, instantly silencing his manic, ragged laughter. The sprawling penthouse descended into an absolute, suffocating stillness, broken only by the distant hum of the city's nocturnal traffic far below the glass walls. Alicia remained curled tightly on the polished marble floor, her breath hitching in her throat. She was entirely unable to comprehend the sudden, violent shift in the execution order she had just braced herself for. Bradley's eyes crossed slightly as he tried to focus on the dark barrel of the weapon pressed directly between his brows. His untouchable corporate arrogance completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a raw, primal confusion that stripped away his humanity. He stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward as he demanded to know what was happening. He frantically reminded the towering hitman of the massive cash payout spilling out of the canvas duffel bag across the floor, offering to double the amount, then triple it, desperately attempting to buy back his absolute authority with stolen funds. The man in the black tactical jacket did not flinch. He did not even glance at the scattered piles of $100 bills. He simply reached up with his free hand and pulled back the heavy fabric of his tactical hood. I watched from the deep shadows of the mahogany corridor as Dominic's face was revealed under the harsh overhead lighting. He looked entirely different from the quiet, unassuming surveillance expert who had sat beside me in the industrial storage bay just hours ago. His expression was carved from solid granite, radiating cold institutional authority and lethal discipline. Bradley's jaw went completely slack. The chief financial officer's mind visibly fractured as he tried to process the impossible geometry of the situation. He recognized Dominic immediately, not as a hired killer, but as the phantom who had been trailing him, the operative who had dismantled his security protocols. Bradley sputtered his demands, asking how this man had infiltrated his secure network and why the assassin he had personally vetted was standing before him with a gun to his head. Dominic maintained his terrifying composure, pressing the barrel just a fraction of an inch deeper into Bradley's skull, forcing the broken executive to look him directly in the eyes. Dominic did not lower his weapon. He spoke with a loud, commanding resonance that reverberated off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. He formally identified himself as a senior undercover agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation attached directly to the Organized Crime and Corporate Financial Fraud Division. The words struck Bradley with the sheer force of a physical blow, draining the last remaining color from his bruised face. Dominic methodically and mercilessly dismantled the final remaining pillars of Bradley's false reality. He explained that Naomi was never acting alone. My brilliant, courageous wife had not just stumbled onto a massive corporate embezzlement ring and decided to play an amateur vigilante. She was a highly vetted, top-tier forensic informant actively working with the federal government to construct a watertight, irrefutable case against Bradley and his ruthless cartel associates. Naomi had spent months quietly feeding the FBI encrypted dossiers, exposing the offshore accounts, isolating the shell companies, and mapping Rachel's banking complicity. Dominic revealed the meticulous, complex depths of the federal operation. When Bradley grew suspicious of Naomi's activities and decided to permanently silence her, the FBI intercepted the encrypted communications. Bradley had indeed contracted a professional ghost to tamper with her vehicle and force it off the treacherous coastal ravine. But federal agents had intercepted that specific operative weeks ago, detaining him in a black site before he could ever strike. Dominic had seamlessly assumed the hitman's identity, stepping directly into the shadows of Bradley's criminal enterprise to monitor his every move and gather actionable intelligence. The entire assassination contract had been a heavily monitored sting operation designed to catch Bradley explicitly ordering a murder. Naomi was supposed to be pulled from the wreckage safely, her death temporarily faked to push Bradley into making a fatal administrative error. But the federal plan had suffered a catastrophic, unforeseen failure. Bradley had not acted alone. Alicia, terrified of losing her illicit trust fund and desperate to maintain her lavish lifestyle, had secretly hired a secondary localized mechanic to sabotage her mother's brake lines 2 days before the federal operation was supposed to go live. The revelation hung in the air, a poisonous cloud of ultimate family betrayal. Dominic had been forced to maintain his deep cover despite the tragic loss, continuing to play the role of the assassin, waiting patiently for the exact moment Bradley would implicate himself in a secondary murder plot. Dominic stated clearly that the grocery store ambush and this penthouse meeting were the final pieces of the puzzle. He had orchestrated the entire sequence, sending the encrypted text message to bait Bradley into ordering the executions of his father-in-law and his own wife on a live recording. The digital traps we had carefully wired throughout the penthouse hours earlier had already done their job with flawless precision. Dominic informed Bradley that the high-definition hidden cameras embedded in the ventilation grates and the audio transmitters concealed beneath the marble coffee table had captured every single second of his murderous monologue. The live feed of his explicit execution order had been transmitted directly to the FBI field office through an external, highly encrypted server. There was no local hard drive to smash. There was no corporate lawyer expensive enough to unwrite the confession he had just proudly broadcast directly to the federal government. As if on cue, the faint, piercing wail of police sirens began to rise from the city streets far below the glass walls. The sound multiplied rapidly, forming a deafening chorus of absolute, inescapable finality. The building was already surrounded by a heavily armed federal task force. Bradley's eyes darted wildly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The realization that his entire life, his immense stolen wealth, and his unassailable freedom were permanently extinguished, snapped whatever fragile tether of sanity he had left. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure, unfiltered desperation. Completely ignoring the shattered bone in his kneecap, Bradley gripped his heavy aluminum crutch with both hands. He swung the metal frame in a violent horizontal arc, aiming directly for Dominic's head with homicidal force. Dominic easily ducked the wild, uncoordinated strike, but the momentum allowed Bradley to break the immediate perimeter. He scrambled away from the gun, dragging his ruined leg behind him, and bolted toward the open balcony doors. He was aiming blindly for the exterior fire escape, choosing the possibility of a fatal drop over the absolute certainty of a federal cage. Bradley's desperate lunge for the exterior fire escape was a pathetic display of a broken man clinging to a shattered reality. He threw his entire body weight heavily against the massive glass doors leading to the sweeping balcony, his expensive leather boots slipping wildly on the polished marble floor. He did not make it past the threshold. A deafening concussive boom violently shook the entire steel foundation of the penthouse. The heavy oak front doors we had stealthily bypassed earlier were entirely blown off their reinforced steel hinges. The massive explosion sent jagged splinters of wood and twisted metal shrapnel raining across the immaculate corporate foyer. A highly coordinated federal tactical unit flooded the living room in a seamless surging wave of dark body armor and heavy ballistic helmets. Searing white beams from a dozen weapon-mounted tactical flashlights pierced the dim lighting of the penthouse, sweeping across the expansive space with absolute, calculated aggression. The air instantly filled with the sharp, overlapping commands of federal agents securing the perimeter. Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as the blinding tactical lights hit him directly in the face. He scrambled frantically toward the balcony railing, entirely ignoring the excruciating agony of his shattered kneecap. Dominic moved faster than the arrogant corporate executive could ever comprehend. The undercover agent closed the distance in 3 massive strides, treating Bradley not as a wealthy mastermind, but as a fleeing, desperate fugitive. Dominic grabbed the thick collar of Bradley's dark hoodie and violently yanked him backward. Bradley's feet flew entirely out from under him, his aluminum crutch clattering uselessly against the thick glass barrier. Dominic slammed him face first onto the cold, hard marble floor of the balcony with bone-jarring force. The massive physical impact instantly neutralized any remaining fight left in Bradley. Dominic drove his heavy knee directly into the center of Bradley's spine, pinning him completely flat against the stone. The sharp metallic ratcheting of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut around Bradley's wrists echoed clearly above the chaos of the raid. The untouchable chief financial officer, the man who had confidently ordered the murder of my wife from the safety of a boardroom, was reduced to a weeping, bleeding mess groveling on the floor of his own sanctuary. His execution plan had failed completely. His illusion of power was officially dead. The tactical unit moved with clinical efficiency to secure the remaining hostiles in the room. 2 heavily armed agents flanked Alicia, loudly demanding she place her hands behind her back. The sudden presence of federal law enforcement completely broke her carefully calculated facade. The engineered tears of a helpless victim instantly morphed into the hysterical, unhinged rage of a spoiled heir losing her stolen empire. Alicia screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with violent indignation. She thrashed wildly against the federal agents, viciously kicking her designer heels against their heavily armored shin guards. She demanded to speak to her expensive corporate lawyers immediately. She shrieked that she was an innocent victim, a hostage, a traumatized daughter who had been dragged into this nightmare against her will by a monstrous husband. The agents ignored her desperate theatrics completely. They grabbed her flailing arms, wrenching them downward with practiced, undeniable force. The cold steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists, permanently silencing her physical resistance. But her verbal assault continued unabated. She twisted her head toward me, begging me to intervene. She explicitly invoked decades of paternal love, screaming that I was supposed to protect her from this, that I was supposed to be her father. I stood perfectly motionless in the exact center of the chaotic, brightly lit living room. I did not move an inch to shield her. I did not offer a single word of comfort or reassurance. My mind drifted back 30 years to a bright summer afternoon in our old suburban driveway. I remembered a tiny girl with scraped knees reaching up to hold my hand, trusting me entirely to fix her broken bicycle. I had spent my entire adult life working tirelessly to protect that innocent child. But the woman screaming obscenities at the federal agents was not my daughter. She was a deeply corrupted parasite. Bradley had fed her inherent greed, teaching her that basic morality was a fundamental weakness and massive wealth was the only true metric of human value. She had embraced that toxic philosophy so completely that she coldly authorized the assassination of the woman who gave her life simply to protect a financial trust fund. I looked at her with the absolute sterile detachment of a senior auditor closing a bankrupt, fraudulent account. The ledger was finally finalized. The emotional deficit was permanent. I watched the 2 people who had brutally destroyed my wife being physically stripped of their freedom, their stolen assets, and their artificial dignity. The justice Naomi had meticulously fought for was manifesting right in front of my eyes. Alicia's frantic pleas slowly devolved into pathetic, defeated sobs as the agents forced her toward the ruined entryway, dragging her away from the massive pile of $100 bills she had brought to pay for my murder. The federal agents hauled Bradley up from the cold marble floor of the balcony. They dragged him forcefully back into the center of the devastated living room, forcing him to stand on his one functioning leg. His expensive tailored clothes were torn and heavily stained with drywall dust from the explosive tactical breach. His face was a horrific canvas of swelling purple bruises and fresh blood leaking steadily from a split lip. He was going to spend the absolute entirety of his natural life locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. As the agents pulled him toward the open doors of the freight elevator, Bradley dug his heels into the polished floor, halting the procession for a fraction of a second. He twisted his neck painfully to look directly at me. The sheer, unadulterated hatred in his eyes burned brightly through his immense physical agony. He spat a thick wad of blood onto the pristine marble floor. A raspy, venomous laugh rattled deep inside his chest, echoing through the penthouse with a sickening, victorious energy. He stared right into my face, his bruised lips curling into a deeply malicious, arrogant smile. He told me that I had won the physical battle tonight, but the financial war was already decisively over. Bradley's voice dripped with ultimate spite as he delivered his final calculated strike. He declared that mere hours before the federal raid hit the regional bank, he had successfully wired every single cent of Naomi's corporate fortune completely offshore into an untraceable, heavily encrypted dark account known as Apex Corp. He laughed maniacally as the federal agents shoved him forward into the elevator corridor, shouting that despite all my planning, I was still absolutely penniless. 1 week passed since the federal tactical unit stormed the penthouse and dragged the architects of my wife's murder into the unforgiving light of justice. The explosive breach of those heavy oak doors marked the absolute end of Bradley's reign. Bradley and Alicia were immediately denied bail, deemed catastrophic flight risks by a federal judge who had listened to the crystal-clear audio of their execution orders in a silent courtroom. They now sat in entirely separate maximum security holding cells at the Metropolitan Detention Center. Bradley's bespoke tailored suits had been permanently replaced by a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit, his shattered kneecaps secured in cheap, rigid medical bracing, and his untouchable offshore empire reduced to a cold, sterile concrete room. Alicia was faring even worse. The spoiled corporate heiress who had coldly ordered a tactical hitman to secure her domestic trust fund was currently experiencing the brutal, unyielding reality of federal incarceration. She was completely stripped of her designer wardrobe, her sycophantic high society friends, and her unearned, bottomless arrogance. I did not visit them. I did not care to hear their desperate pleas, their manufactured tears, or their toxic cyclical recriminations. My focus remained entirely on finalizing the complex audit my wife had started. I walked through the sliding glass doors of a towering commercial skyscraper in the heart of the bustling financial district, stepping into the immaculate executive suite of Naomi's lead corporate attorney, Marcus Vance. The massive space was a fortress of polished mahogany and panoramic glass, projecting an aura of absolute legal invincibility. Marcus was a sharp, meticulous veteran of corporate litigation who had worked quietly alongside Naomi for over 2 decades. He stood up from his massive desk as I entered, offering a firm handshake and a solemn nod of profound respect. He had been fully briefed by the FBI on the explosive events of the Penthouse raid and the successful recovery of Naomi's authentic last will and testament. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and placed the wax-sealed parchment directly onto the center of his pristine desk. We bypassed the standard, polite pleasantries entirely. The time for quiet grieving had passed. This meeting was the final tactical maneuver in a war my wife had fought valiantly from the shadows. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair opposite Marcus, folding my hands over the silver handle of my walking cane. I instructed him to officially open the probate process and execute Naomi's authentic directives without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. Marcus broke the seal on the authentic will, carefully spreading the thick aged parchment across his desk. He read through the initial paragraphs, confirming the absolute, undeniable disinheritance of Alicia and the immediate liquidation of Bradley's remaining domestic assets to completely fund the elder abuse charity. But as his sharp eyes reached the final legal addendum of the document, a deeply appreciative smile broke across the attorney's usually stoic face. He looked up at me, his expression gleaming with the pure recognition of absolute strategic genius. He meticulously explained the profound brilliance of the trap Naomi had laid for our treacherous son-in-law. Bradley's final venomous boast in the Penthouse had been that he successfully wired the entirety of Naomi's corporate fortune offshore into a heavily encrypted, untraceable dark account belonging to a massive holding company known as Apex Corp. He genuinely believed he had executed the ultimate digital heist, moving the stolen millions completely beyond the reach of federal seizure or my own recovery efforts. He was fatally incorrect. Marcus turned his sleek laptop monitor toward me, displaying a complex, highly classified organizational chart tracing international financial acquisitions over the past 18 months. Naomi had known about Apex Corp long before Bradley ever initiated his offshore laundering scheme. During the critical months leading up to her murder, when Bradley arrogantly assumed she was attending trivial regional networking events or routine business trips, my wife was actively executing a hostile phantom takeover. Working strictly through Marcus and a labyrinthine network of anonymous shell entities, proxy buyers, and blind trusts, Naomi had systematically acquired massive blocks of equity in Apex Corp. She aggressively bought out the silent partners and foreign investors, moving with absolute stealth to avoid triggering any internal corporate alarms. She leveraged her immense forensic accounting expertise to permanently mask the origin of the purchasing funds, ensuring that the current executive board remained entirely blind to the identity of their new primary stakeholder. By the time Bradley finalized his cartel laundering routes and designated Apex Corp as his impenetrable digital vault, Naomi had already secured a controlling 65% equity stake in the overarching conglomerate. She literally owned the vault. Bradley had not hidden the stolen millions from us. He had painstakingly gathered all his illicit gains, liquidated his criminal collateral, and willingly transferred every single cent directly into a corporate structure that my wife legally controlled. Every single dollar he wired offshore was legally secured under Naomi's umbrella. The ultimate irony was completely staggering. The cartel would soon discover that their trusted launderer had voluntarily surrendered their operational capital to a ghost. The monumental scale of his arrogance had blinded him to the simplest rule of forensic accounting. You cannot hide money in a house you do not own. Naomi had essentially built a massive financial slaughterhouse, left the front door wide open, and waited patiently for Bradley to herd his own stolen wealth inside before permanently locking the heavy gates. She had completely outplayed the chief financial officer on a global scale. The full magnitude of Naomi's final act of defiance settled over me like a heavy protective armor. She had not only ensured the permanent safety of my future, she had effectively weaponized the enemy's own boundless greed to orchestrate his absolute, inescapable ruin. Marcus pulled a thick, leather-bound portfolio from his locked desk drawer and opened it, revealing a dense stack of highly classified corporate transfer documents. He explained that as Naomi's sole named beneficiary, the entire sprawling portfolio of shell companies and blind trusts instantly transferred directly to my legal name. Marcus slid a heavy engraved platinum pen across the polished mahogany desk. The metal felt cold and substantial against my fingers. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I leaned forward and signed my name on the designated lines, executing the final legal maneuver of the war. The ink dried on the thick paper, cementing an absolute reality that Bradley could never have anticipated in his worst feverish nightmares. I was no longer just a retired auditor fighting for basic survival against a corrupt, murderous family. I was now the supreme majority shareholder and absolute owner of Apex Corp. I completely owned the board of directors. I autonomously controlled the offshore accounts. I was the absolute master of the very corporation where Bradley had proudly and arrogantly served as chief financial officer. The millions he had stolen, the dangerous cartel money he had washed, and the elite future he thought he had secured were all resting firmly in the palm of my hand. Bradley thought he was a cunning predator manipulating the board, but he had just spent the last 2 years dutifully depositing blood money directly into my personal bank account. I stood up from the leather chair and firmly gripped my oak cane. It was time to visit the Metropolitan Detention Center. I had a final audit to deliver. I stood before the full-length mirror in the hotel suite, adjusting the cuffs of my immaculate tailor-made black suit. For months, I had intentionally worn faded sweaters and worn-out slacks, playing the part of the grieving, vulnerable father-in-law. Bradley and his corporate cronies had looked at my modest attire and seen weakness. They had looked at my silver hair and seen an easy target. Today, they would look at me and see their absolute ruin. I grasped the silver handle of my oak walking cane, feeling the solid weight of Naomi's final masterstroke anchoring me to the present. I stepped out of the luxury suite and descended to the waiting black SUV. Dominic stood by the open rear door dressed sharply in a dark federal suit, a silent acknowledgement of the permanent shift in power. We drove in silence through the heart of the financial district. The headquarters of Apex Corp was a towering monolith of smoked glass and brushed steel, a physical manifestation of the immense wealth Bradley had thought he controlled. I walked through the revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling vaulted lobby. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side was a formidable phalanx of senior federal auditors, cybercrime specialists, and heavily armed corporate security contractors holding strict federal warrants. The receptionist's eyes widened in sheer panic as our procession bypassed the front desk entirely. I did not ask for permission to enter. I possessed the supreme majority shareholder documents in my breast pocket. I legally owned the floor beneath their feet. We stepped into the private executive elevator and rode in absolute silence to the 52nd floor. The polished mahogany doors of the executive boardroom loomed at the end of the corridor. Inside that room sat the elite syndicate of corrupt executives who had facilitated Bradley's massive cartel laundering operation. These were the men and women who had gladly signed the orders to freeze my domestic accounts, legally isolate me, and attempt to throw me into a psychiatric ward to protect their illicit profit margins. They believed they were gathering for an emergency crisis meeting regarding their missing chief financial officer. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, stepping into the center of the lion's den. The executive boardroom was a cavernous space dominated by a massive, polished obsidian table. 14 high-level corporate officers sat in expensive leather chairs, their faces etched with deep concern over Bradley's sudden and inexplicable disappearance. When the heavy doors swung inward, their conversation abruptly ceased. The interim chief executive officer, a slick, aggressively groomed man who had personally authorized the freeze on my pension accounts, stood up with a look of profound indignation. He opened his mouth to demand my immediate removal, citing strict security protocols and private corporate property. I did not give him the opportunity to form a complete sentence. I walked deliberately to the absolute head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the ultimate authority in the room, and sat down. Dominic and the team of federal auditors immediately spread out, securing every exit and standing directly behind the seated executives. The indignation in the room rapidly curdled into raw, suffocating panic. I withdrew the heavy leather-bound portfolio containing Naomi's transfer documents and placed it precisely in the center of the obsidian table. I spoke with a voice entirely devoid of warmth, mercy, or hesitation. I formally introduced myself as the supreme majority shareholder and absolute legal owner of Apex Corp. I watched the color rapidly drain from 14 arrogant faces as the reality of the legal documents registered. I did not raise my voice. I operated with the surgical, relentless precision of a forensic accountant finalizing a catastrophic audit. I looked directly at the interim CEO and detailed his exact complicity in Bradley's cartel laundering scheme. I named the offshore shell companies they had utilized. I recited the specific routing numbers they had used to wash the blood money. I outlined how they had knowingly and willingly weaponized the legal system to freeze my assets and isolate me, acting as loyal accomplices to a man who had murdered my wife. A suffocating, terrifying silence gripped the boardroom. One of the senior vice presidents desperately attempted to speak, stammering out a fragile excuse about corporate compartmentalization and lack of operational oversight. I silenced her with a single, sharp motion of my hand. I informed the room that their employment was permanently terminated, effective immediately. I announced that I had already executed my authority to completely freeze all of their corporate compensation packages, severance clauses, and stock options. They would not receive a single cent of the wealth they had accumulated through my family's suffering. I gestured to the federal agents flanking the room. On my command, the auditors stepped forward and physically confiscated every single corporate laptop, encrypted hard drive, and mobile device resting on the obsidian table. The executives sat frozen, entirely paralyzed by the sudden, absolute destruction of their careers and their freedom. They were no longer corporate titans. They were federal suspects trapped in a cage I had just locked. I stood up from the head of the table, leaving the terrified, ruined executives in the capable hands of the federal authorities. I did not look back as I walked out of the boardroom, my oak cane striking the floor with a steady, rhythmic finality. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, watching the digital floor numbers count backward, matching the systematic dismantling of Bradley's criminal empire. The immense pressure that had weighed on my chest for the past several weeks finally began to dissipate. I walked through the sprawling glass lobby and pushed through the revolving doors. I stepped out of the towering skyscraper and directly into the bright, blinding light of the afternoon sun. The chaotic noise of the city rushed over me, but for the first time since Naomi's death, the sound did not feel overwhelming. It felt like a symphony of renewed existence. The financial empire had been completely and thoroughly cleansed. The corrupt executives who had enabled my wife's murder were ruined, destined to spend the rest of their lives fighting federal indictments with frozen bank accounts. The power dynamic that Bradley and Alicia had so ruthlessly exploited was permanently inverted. They had believed that supreme wealth granted them the ultimate authority to dictate life and death. Naomi had proven them catastrophically wrong. She had weaponized their own unquenchable greed against them, using their criminal infrastructure to build the exact trap that secured my absolute safety. I stood on the bustling sidewalk, breathing in the crisp, fresh air. I felt Naomi's brilliant protective spirit standing right beside me in the sunlight. The ledger was perfectly balanced. The audit was officially closed. My life was finally mine again. The morning air carried a sharp, cleansing chill as I walked through the heavy wrought iron gates of the city cemetery. I held a massive bouquet of vibrant yellow sunflowers tightly against my chest. They were Naomi's absolute favorite, a bright reflection of the brilliant, unyielding light she had always brought into my world. The manicured grounds were entirely silent, offering a stark and welcome contrast to the chaotic corporate battlegrounds I had navigated over the past few weeks. I navigated the winding cobblestone path until I reached the crest of a small, quiet hill. I knelt slowly onto the damp grass before the polished black granite of my wife's headstone. I gently laid the bright sunflowers against the dark stone, tracing the engraved letters of her name with a steady hand. I spoke to her in a quiet, measured voice, delivering the final definitive report of the audit she had initiated. I detailed exactly how the battle had ended. Bradley's opulent penthouse had been completely seized and liquidated by federal authorities under strict asset forfeiture laws. I had personally directed my newly acquired executive power at Apex Corp to ensure the funds from that penthouse sale were immediately weaponized. Every single dollar was systematically utilized to dismantle the legal defenses of the corrupt banking executives who had facilitated her murder. Their expensive defense attorneys abandoned them the moment their corporate accounts were permanently frozen. The financial syndicate was completely eradicated, stripped down to the very studs, and erased from the district. I sat there in the quiet stillness of the graveyard, listening to the gentle rustle of the autumn leaves overhead. For decades, I had played the role of the quiet, unassuming provider, absorbing the disrespect of those who believed kindness equated to weakness. That era was permanently over. For the first time since the night she was taken from me, the heavy, suffocating weight of grief did not crush my lungs. Instead, I found a deep, unshakable peace. The truth had not only been exposed, it had been armed, mobilized, and deployed with absolute terminal precision. Naomi had won. Miles away from the quiet serenity of the cemetery, the atmosphere inside the Metropolitan Maximum Security Correctional Facility was an oppressive void of concrete and cold steel. Alicia sat perfectly rigid in a molded plastic chair inside the stark, fluorescent-lit visitation room. The tailored silk blouses, the platinum jewelry, and the bottomless arrogance that had once defined her entire identity were permanently replaced by a coarse, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Her hair was unkempt, her posture tense, and her eyes darted frantically as she waited behind the thick, reinforced security glass. A heavy metal door groaned open, admitting her court-appointed defense attorney. He did not carry the thick binders of a rigorous legal defense strategy. He carried a single, thin manila folder. He sat down heavily across from her, activating the two-way intercom system. His expression was entirely devoid of sympathy or professional optimism. He slid a crisp, freshly printed legal notice through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. Alicia snatched the document with trembling, eager fingers. She had spent the last 7 days clinging to a single, desperate lifeline. She knew about Naomi's secondary life insurance policy, a massive $5 million premium that had been established years ago. Alicia genuinely believed that as the only surviving biological child, she could maneuver the legal system to claim those funds, hire a team of elite corporate litigators, and buy her way out of federal prison. She read the first paragraph, her eyes scanning the legal terminology with frantic speed. The policy had indeed been fully paid out by the underwriters. The $5 million was officially released. But as she read the final addendum, all the blood instantly drained from her face. Her breathing hitched, accelerating into a sharp, ragged hyperventilation. The document explicitly outlined my strict, unassailable directives as the primary executor of the estate. Acting entirely within my legal rights, I had irrevocably transferred every single cent of the $5 million payout into an impenetrable charitable trust. The funds were immediately deployed to purchase and construct a state-of-the-art domestic abuse shelter designed to protect and rehabilitate vulnerable women escaping violent homes. The facility was permanently endowed and officially named in honor of Naomi. The legal trap was completely flawless and entirely binding. There was no appeal process. There were no loopholes left to exploit. Alicia had orchestrated the brutal assassination of her own mother for a financial payout that she would never touch. Her bottomless greed had yielded absolutely nothing. She was left entirely penniless, utterly isolated, and facing a guaranteed life sentence without a single dollar to mount a defense. The profound, crushing reality of her complete defeat struck Alicia with the force of a physical blow. The legal document slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering uselessly onto the scuffed linoleum floor. She collapsed heavily against the thick, reinforced glass, her palms slamming against the unyielding barrier. A raw, guttural wail tore from her throat, echoing pitifully off the sterile concrete walls. She sobbed with ultimate shattered desperation as the reality of her permanent cage finally settled in. She screamed my name, begging for a mercy she fundamentally did not deserve. The attorney simply packed up his empty briefcase and turned away, signaling the guards. Two heavily armored corrections officers stepped forward, gripping her arms firmly and dragging her away from the glass, hauling her back into the dark, endless labyrinth of the cell blocks. Far away from the misery of the prison walls, I stood up from the soft grass of the cemetery. I leaned my weight comfortably against my oak walking cane and looked down at the bright yellow sunflowers resting against the dark granite. The late afternoon sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting a rich golden glow over the quiet grounds. The crisp breeze carried away the last lingering shadows of the past months. The violent storm that had threatened to consume my existence had finally broken, leaving behind a world built on profound clarity and unshakable truth. I turned and walked slowly down the cobblestone path toward the open gates. My posture was resolute. My conscience was perfectly clear. I stepped out into the vibrant, beautiful evening entirely free. True power does not reside in loud arrogance or the accumulation of stolen wealth. It is forged in quiet resilience, meticulous planning, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. When faced with profound betrayal, the greatest weapon one can wield is absolute patience. Monsters who build their empires on deceit always construct the very cages that will eventually imprison them. By refusing to surrender to blind anger, we allow the truth to methodically dismantle the strongest fortresses of corruption. In the end, genuine integrity will always outlast the fragile temporary illusions created by malicious greed. Light exposes the darkest secrets completely. If this story of silent vengeance and ultimate justice captivated you, hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling chapter of our channel's original narratives.